Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Podcast Summit. This is number 7 in the series, so we're back for another round. And this one, I think, is going to really intrigue you guys. It's an item that, as far as I know, we're going to discuss a work by Ed Wood that, as far as I know, maybe has not been viewed or read in perhaps many decades, as far as I know, except by the two of us. So, and this is Paul Apel who's joining me. Paul's a copywriter and writer, and he and I are members of a private Ed Wood Facebook group. And we talked a little, up until about a month ago, we had talked sporadically back and forth, messaged on a couple of Ed Wood related items. But then when the item came into play that we're about to talk about here today, the two of us started to really talk quite frequently about it. And I was happy to invite him. Well, I was happy that he accepted my invitation to appear here at the Ed Wood Podcast Summit to talk about an Ed Wood screenplay. So I'm not even going to reveal that just yet, because first I want to toss it over to Paul. Anything you wanted to say as an opener?
Oh, hey, first of all, I just want to say it's good to talk to you face to face finally. And
Cool, right.
It's fun to be involved in the whole Ed Wood thing. For, most of my life, I've been interested in Ed Wood, and ever since the Tim Burton movie came out when I was a teenager at the time. And I always wished I had something to contribute other than just, it's fun reading all the stuff that everyone else comes up with.
Yeah.
But maybe something would come my way someday that was unique. And so this script was kind of an opportunity to be able to take a look at something that, as far as I've never seen. I mean, I've seen the title mentioned.
Right.
I've never seen anyone talk about it. It's not in Nightmare of Ecstasy. It's I've never seen an article about it. I mean, I saw your article about the fact that it exists, but never any kind of description of its contents or anything. So
right. I may be being too coy here in saying we're not going to reveal it yet. Truthfully, it's probably going to be right in the title of the YouTube video, review of what this is. So cat out of the bag, let the cat out of the bag. It is the screenplay for the Frank Leahy Legend. So yeah, Paul, I never really saw this one floating around at all. The only mention I think that was made of it was I believe it was a resume that Ed had supplied Fred Olin Ray sometime back around 1977 or 78. And
right.
That it's listed in that list of his screenplays as the next to last screenplay. They're not in chronological fashion though, but it is certainly one of the later screenplays that he wrote. It's also one of the few screenplays that he wrote that is outside the realm of genre film, right? Genre
Right.
films generally, whether you're talking sci-fi, horror, or you're talking, I mean, I guess I'm considering pornography a genre, which,
Right.
right, the sex genre. So,
Mm-hmm.
right. But, so where does the script actually come from? So anyway, I wrote an article about a month ago at the Ed Wood Wednesdays blog, and prior to writing it, Joe Blevins clued me in that, and it was because he had reminded me of the Frank Leahy Legend script. On one of his Happy Days podcasts, he mentioned Frank Leahy. Well, he didn't mention Frank Leahy by name. I think he did, but anyway, it spurred my interest because I hadn't really dug into Frank Leahy in a number of years, and I really thought, whatever that screenplay is, we're never going to know. Whatever went on there, we're never going to know. It's intriguing, but that's about all we'll know. And I dug a little bit deeper, found a few things enough to warrant putting together an article. And in the process of that, Joe said to me that somewhere he believed in his recollection on Facebook, someone had somewhere along the way mentioned that Loyola Marymount University in their digital archives have a copy of the script. So that's I mentioned that in the article. Paul subsequently made a formal request through the library, as did I, and that's how the two of us started to really eagerly on a day-by-day basis. We were checking in with each other. What's going on? Have you heard anything from the librarian? Have you heard anything from Jessica at the library, who turned out to be our angel,
Yeah.
because she managed to get this thing into our hands. So take it, Paul. Go from there a little bit more about the experience we had with the library.
Well, I couldn't believe when I first read the article. I couldn't believe that there's this screenplay sitting in an archive somewhere that anyone could ask for, and no one had asked for. So I thought, well, let me give it a shot. And with the pandemic going on and everything and working from home and stuff, a lot more time to follow up on thoughts like that rather than thinking, oh, I'll do it some other time. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I just asked right away, thought maybe I'd never hear anything. I talked to a friend of mine who used to work in a library and said, no, librarians love it when you ask for stuff. They'll totally get back to you. So, and they did. And a little bit of back and forth, but, and actually they ended up sending the entire screenplay, which I was reading the fine print, and I was worried they might only send like, I think you can only request like 40 pages a year or something like that.
Right.
But the whole thing came over, and it only took a couple weeks, and I was originally going to have them mail it because I didn't want to pay for the scanning, but they said, due to what's going on in the world, we'll give you the scanning for a cut rate. So they sent it digitally, and I printed it out and took some notes on it. And
I still haven't printed a copy yet, but certainly I'm going to print it up for myself and bind it there. You're going to show us your copy.
Yeah, I'll show you what this thing looks like. It's pretty
guys,
thick.
193 pages, as you mentioned. So it was astonishing that we got the whole thing. For me, you said, it came pretty quickly. For me, it was actually a very suspenseful couple of weeks because I sort of been down roads before where there's talk of some Ed Wood related work or item that has been unearthed, and then somehow it falls apart, and as I try to pursue it, and ultimately I come up, trumps. But in this case, it was real. And I remember the first time, little perhaps typical bureaucracy, I hit the chat button on the library page and chatted quickly with a librarian who was like, it's got a copyright. This whole collection that this is a part of is copywritten material, and you have to be an LMU student to come view it on site. That's the only way you can see it. And by the way, because of COVID, the library's closed right now, so shot me down in every way imaginable, right? But did say, go ahead and fill out a formal archive request. That's the right thing for you to do, which I did. And subsequently back and forth with I believe really, Paul, the librarian, Jessica, who picked up the request, was really instrumental in making this happen. They could very well have said, yeah, you can get 40 pages. They could very well have maintained that line, right? It's copyright material. Sorry, Charlie, you can't have it. Right. But she said to me in an email back, she said, I went to the head of the special collections department and got them to agree to release it as long as, we give you some copyright stipulations, which wasn't saying that it is or isn't copywritten. It's just saying essentially you're taking responsibility for understanding the copyright implications. And it does in fact show a copyright on the cover page, copywritten by the is it 76? I think the copyright says copyright 1976. Oh yeah, you have the copyright in your hand. Copyright 1976.
Yeah, 76.
Yeah, on that same page, the top of the cover page. And I'll at the Ed Wood Wednesdays, when this goes up at Ed Wood Wednesdays, and this video is linked there, we'll put some additional material, including some not only some our favorite lines and moments from the screenplay, share some of those, but some images from the screenplay itself, which looks like it's right off of a typewritten copy. It's got some hand strikeouts and things of that nature, and it's even got Ed's own little signature on the cover page with the actual date, September 1975. So that suggests pretty much exactly when he wrote this sucker. But anyway, going back to the library real quick. Ultimately, we were able to get a scanned PDF of the thing for a quarter a page, so under $50, right? So it was well worth it. What I don't know, Paul, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but if anybody were to follow on us perhaps now and make this request to Loyola Marymount, I would assume that they would continue to release it, right?
Yeah, I would assume so.
Right. I guess, and of course there's the fair use stipulation. You can go ahead and review it, which is exactly what we're doing here today. So we're acting in fair use, but that brings us to today. We're now that we've both digested this and read it. How about jump back to you, Paul? Let's go into a little bit of the background of the screenplay itself in relation to the book, in relation to who this guy is, Frank Leahy.
Well, you might actually know more about that than I do, but that is one of the things that was intriguing. I mean, other than always wanting to find new stuff or new to us stuff by Ed Wood, The real strange thing about this is it didn't seem to fit any of his interests, which that Frank Leahy being a Notre Dame football coach. And the only time football comes up in relation to Ed Wood is that he did not like football and that he was watching football when he had his heart attack.
Right.
So there's so many questions came up, like how did this get written? He probably was hired by someone to write it. He wouldn't have said, I'm interested in this subject necessarily. Or maybe we would read it and find out everyone's wrong and he does love this subject and it was a passion of his no one's ever known about,
Right.
Or maybe we get it from the archives and by some total coincidence it's clearly not Ed Wood at all and someone was wrong. So these are all the mysteries I was wondering about, and we got it, and it's clearly written by Ed Wood.
Yeah, pretty clearly, right?
And it seems to be a work for hire, if you can believe the contents of the screenplay, and based on a book of the same name. And so you actually looked over that book. I haven't yet.
Yeah, the Frank Leahy legend. So yeah, Frank Leahy. Let's talk a little bit more about Frank Leahy. He was a Notre Dame coach, rather. He played on two of Knute Rockne. By the way, I'm not a football fan. Paul knows this, so I'm going to sound very credible right now in all these things that I tell you all about Notre Dame football, only because I've been immersing myself in it over the past month or so. It had nothing to do with any love. Trust me. No love for Notre Dame here. In fact, probably a little bit of an irreverent attitude against Notre Dame because the institution that is supposed to be a humanist institution really put winning above all else. And Frank, I don't want to get way the hell ahead of myself, but Frank is not really the most empathetic. Yes, he's a Catholic. Is he a good Catholic? That's questionable actually after you read the book, or after you read the book or read the screenplay. So the book was written that the screenplay was based on was published in 1974. Frank passed away in 1973, and yes, going way back, he played on two of Knute Rockne's national title teams. 3 years for Knute Rockne in total. Then he went on kind of a road tour in the 1930s across a number of schools, working his way up the ladder as a coach, and getting up the ladder at bigger schools, and finally landing at Notre Dame in the early 1940s. And he ultimately spent more than a decade there, minus a couple years that he spent. He enlisted during the war, enlisted in the Navy. So a couple years downtime in the middle of his stint. But he amassed a record that is almost unparalleled. He for coaches that coached in NCAA sort of Division I football, if you want to call it that, although that wasn't really what it was considered back then. For that within that realm, if you look at coaches who coached for more than 10 years at that level, Knute Rockne and Frank Leahy are the only two guys who have more seasons coached than losses. Knute, of course, is a legend, and although this is called the Frank Leahy legend, unless you're a really super hardcore Notre Dame fan or super hardcore football fan, you may not have a clue who Frank Leahy is. He really did live in Knute's shadow in a lot of ways, and I think he knew that, and I think that impacted him throughout his life. But they have very similar records. If you look at their win-loss tie record and their winning percentage record, they're extremely similar. In fact, Frank is second only to Knute for winning percentage, again, amongst coaches in that realm. Curiously enough, what do you think, Paul, when you read the screenplay? There's quite a bit there's not a lot of intricacies about football. Some of the football scenes move right into montage scenes. Ed suggests, at the discretion of the director, go ahead and do a montage. But he does talk about some, things like the T formation, Frank's famous T formation, and the 7 blocks of granite, another one of Frank's coaching devices.
Yeah. Well, most of those things. So here's the thing: it's hard to tell where the limits of football knowledge are and where the limits of his Ed Wood's writing is. So, because you're right, he mentions these things, but he never, like, to a layperson like me, like, I don't know that much about football. when I read the screenplay, I didn't really learn anything about football. So if I was watching the movie, I wouldn't come away from the movie. I mean, unless the director takes the reins and shows things visually, um, as written, I wouldn't know. He mentions the T formation. People say the T formation is going to be a big deal. It comes up again later, several pages later. They never once give an example of what it is. There's no scene dramatizing what it is. It seems like every time, first of all, the screenplay avoids getting into football as long as possible. When it eventually gets into football, like you say, every time they skip over, like there's a scene about how important this upcoming game is. Cut to not the game, but the aftermath of the game.
Yeah.
Or another scene, super important game coming up. Cut to halftime in the locker room.
Yeah.
So it never goes into, well, rarely goes into trying to dramatize, even if an important person gets injured or something. For the most part, Ed is telling, the first rule for every writer is show, don't tell. And Ed does a lot of telling when it comes to
Right.
football. And I mean, not in great detail, but as
Right.
far as what's going on, as opposed to, showing the viewer what's happening on the field and that kind of stuff. So in that sense, it's kind of a limitation for a sports movie, I guess.
Right. Yeah, is it a sports movie? It's obviously a hagiography or a biography. It's questionable which of those you may consider it. So the book that it's based on is written by a gentleman named Bernard D. Williams, and in the book, in the screenplay, um, he's a character in the screenplay. He opens talking to his son under a shade tree. Hey, Dad, will you tell me about the guy you wrote a book about, Frank Leahy? So that's kind of the frame around it.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie more or less melts into the background very, very quickly, and a little bit of voiceover here and there subsequently throughout the remainder of the screenplay. But in the book, the device of the book is that Bernie went ahead. He was friends with Frank Leahy, quote unquote, his closest friend, and he went and interviewed him in 1971, by which time Frank was quite ill. Frank had leukemia. He battled it, from what I understand, for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
literally decades. But so anyway, Bernard Williams says that, he interviewed Frank in 1971, recorded tapes, and the book, The Frank Leahy Legend, that came out in 1973, is rooted in those tapes. I'm not going to get into the relation between the book and the screenplay beyond that here today. Paul and I have talked a little bit more about this, and certainly we've got additional thoughts on that. But I think requires a much deeper dive into comparison and contrast between the screenplay and the book. What I can say, yeah, I read the 2009 reprint version of the Frank Leahy Legend, which was called Iron Desire. You can get it for a song on Kindle, I think for $3.99 or something like that. I've said in the initial article I wrote, it's kind of crap, right? It's very much alpha male nonsense, but win at all costs, sort of constantly building up Frank Leahy. So that was skimming across it. As I took a closer look at it subsequently, it's kind of interesting now that I've read the screenplay, and I know that Ed wrote the screenplay. I'm biasing myself, obviously, to garner a little bit more interest than I otherwise would have had. But again, what I will say is that the screenplay does source much of its material and its sequence of events largely from the interview in the book. So it definitely is very much based upon it. Because, yeah, that was the question I had in my head too, Paul, until we saw the screenplay. Is it going to be, is this based on the book, The Frank Leahy Legend, just because it happens to have the name, the screenplay, The Frank Leahy Legend? And if so, how much, and all of that. But Bernard Williams is mentioned in the book as a quote unquote businessman and industrialist. And there's a couple of indicators in the book that he is quite an older man himself by this point, which not revealed in the screenplay. You really don't know one way or the other. But he mentions being at games when he was a younger man, when Knute Rockne was coaching. So he himself is Bernard Williams' older man, presumably now probably long since passed. He did write this book and put it out in 1973 under this little tiny press called JCL Services, and they released it both as a paperback, mass market paperback edition, as well as a slip-covered, leather-bound sort of deluxe edition. And I actually, I ordered one myself just yesterday, so I'm looking forward to getting that. And that's, again, another subject for another day. So just to kind of catch us up to where this all came from. So Bernard Williams is the guy who makes this happen. It is, talk about, Paul, an unauthorized biography, though, right? He
Well,
yeah.
it's strange because I feel like I've seen both. When I look it up online, a bunch of sources specifically call out, this is the unauthorized biography of Frank Leahy. But if it's based on, 10 hours of tapes, from a personal acquaintance of Leahy, for it to believe the screenplay, in the screenplay, it gets meta towards the end because Leahy is worrying, his post sports life is a failure and no one's going to remember him. And someone suggests, well, they made a Knute Rockne movie. Why don't you make a movie too, or whatever? And so, as you mentioned, Bernard Williams is a character in the book, both narrating it and then later on, approaches Leahy about writing, a character in the screenplay approaches him about writing the book, and they start collaborating together. And the last 10 or 20 pages of the screenplay are kind of about how the book came to be. And I started for a second, I was like, wait a minute, is this going to get so insane that it's going to get to where Ed's writing about himself getting hired to write the screenplay? Because that's one of the big question marks is what was the connection there?
Right.
How did he end up being the guy who wrote the screenplay? Who knows? No one knows yet.
That's hard to track down. If you look at the collection at Loyola Marymount University that this was a part of, a really massive collection of screenplays that was, according to the library site, bequeathed to the librarian by a church, and a church, I forget exactly where they were located address-wise, but they were just south of Hollywood. They were like, somebody confirmed to me, I'm not from Southern California, but confirmed to me that this church would have literally been like a 15 minutes walking distance from Ed's haunts back in this time where he lived in the 70s and around North and West Hollywood. And it was the Blessed Sacrament Church. It's still there. It's more so a mission, and it looks like a food pantry today. But at some point, I think in the mid 90s, the church donated this huge screenplay collection to Loyola Marymount. The pastor at the church at the time, he had some background in education, from what I read, some connection to Loyola Marymount, so it made sense for him to want to put it into the hands of, academics. What was the church really going to do with it? But the supposition on the library page is that one of the parishioners who was deceased donated his or her screenplay collection to the library. And it's a freaking massive collection, right? It goes all the way back to, there's screenplays from the 1930s right through the 1980s and 90s.
Even there's silent movies in there.
Yeah, it's a staggering collection, and lots of what are listed as rare copies, somebody's hand annotated copy, some star in the movie, or the first draft of some big Hollywood classic, and then in the midst of this, the first draft of the Frank Leahy Legend by Ed Wood. It doesn't compute. So how did that end up in this collection? I mean, it's puzzling to me. I don't even have a speculation. Do you have a speculation?
Well, no, my only speculation doesn't really add up because you're tempted to think, well, Catholicism is a through line here because you got Notre Dame, and then you've got, if you read the screenplay, they make sure to mention the Catholic connection multiple times, and it came via a Catholic church, but the whole rest of the collection has nothing. You can't, if you look at the collection, you're not like, oh yeah, these are all religious themed screenplays or screenplays dealing with Catholicism. It's like, Star Wars and famous things like that. Yeah. So even though it seems to make sense that a screenplay about Frank Leahy would come from a Catholic church, the whole rest of the collection doesn't add up to that. So I don't know if Catholicism is just a red herring or what. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have a clue how it could have happened.
Or I guess the only other thing I could think is if Bernard Williams was Catholic, which I assume he probably was.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he, being interested in film enough to try to get a film produced, maybe he had a collection. Maybe his own screenplay was in the collection, and he donated it to the church or something, but you'd think they would know. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's not as if he's a famous person or anything.
That's interesting.
But
That's good. That's good, Paul, because later in the book, when his wife is on her deathbed, in the screenplay as well, these scenes again. I bleed some of this together. Unfortunately, they're very similar in so many ways, and sometimes I can't remember exactly which detail was in which right off the top of my head at this point. But Bernard Williams' wife is dying, and Frank, of course, is very ill. So towards the end of her life, Frank goes to visit her, and Bernie mentions that we'll be in Newport Beach. We'll be in Newport Beach. So Newport Beach is just a stone's throw from Torrance, California, which is where the publisher, JCL Services, who published the book, hails from. So it kind of makes me think, I'm sorry, the dogs are going berserk, actually. As you can tell, you've heard them. They're always a fixture here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Yeah. Obviously, I don't have to buy a security system at my house, because nobody in their right mind is going to come near my house, because that's what happens when somebody's a quarter mile down the sidewalk. They go this berserk. So anyway, Bernard Williams is living for whatever reason in Southern California. He did, from what I understand, he was a Notre Dame. He did go to Notre Dame. So yeah, I would presume he was Catholic as well. And if you kind of, now that I'm thinking about it, you line up the timelines, right? He says, I went to Knute Rockne games. He could have been a kid back then. Let's just say, 1920. 1915, 1920. Then this screenplay collection turns up around 1995. So roughly 75, 80 year time frame, kind of the, a person's lifespan, generally speaking, for many people. So could that have been could actually the parishioner have been Bernard Williams? I think that's fascinating, because in the book, he mentions being a businessman and industrialist. So presumably he's quite a successful guy. Yeah. Could he have had this avocation collecting screenplays? And at some point along the way, as you got a little older, start to feel that sense of your days being numbered, and I want to do something with my life. I'm kind of in that, actually, I'm in that place in life right now. So I understand that. The book is written, and then, commissions Ed to write the screenplay, presumably. And also there was a blurb I found in a Chicago newspaper. I think it was the Chicago Tribune, and it was, I believe, May 3rd, 1975. And it was just one of those around town sort of entertainment articles, columns by a local writer. But in it, just a couple sentence mention saying a couple films are going to be shooting here in this upcoming summer, right here in Chicago, including some film about Muhammad Ali, and then the Frank Leahy Legend. So by Scotty Williams Enterprises. So you had a thought on that?
No, I was just confused by it because I
saw. That's a thought. A confused thought.
So on the resume that Ed typed up for Fred Olin Ray, where it says that one of the screenplays he wrote was the Frank Leahy Legend, it says in parentheses that he wrote it for Scotty Williams Entertainment. And I thought this was interesting because Scotty Williams is a different name from Bernard Williams, but they do share the same last name. So then we're thinking, is it a brother? Is it a son? If you're to believe the screenplay, the son mentioned in the screenplay is Bernie Jr.
Right.
Of course, you can have more than one son, or call your son Scotty because you don't want to call him by the same first name as you. Call him by his middle name or something. Or who knows, could be anything, but it couldn't find, Googled Scotty Williams Entertainment, can't find anything they ever actually, can't find anything about it at all.
Right.
So.
Yeah, me too. Struck out on that score. And Bernard Williams is such a common name. I can't even find a Bernard Williams, confirm that a Bernard Williams went to Notre Dame. Did I pour over every yearbook year by year? No, of course I didn't. But in any case, so that's a little bit of the background history of how this thing came into being. So let's jump right into the opening scene of the screenplay is the birth of Frank, right? And it's almost got a religious sort of tenor to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's like he's Abraham Lincoln or some huge figure like that or something. But actually, before that, the first thing I noticed was you already mentioned the framing device. First of all, every Ed Wood movie has to have a framing device, right? At least one. most of them have, or some of them have, like Glen or Glenda is, one framing device after another to the point where it becomes an entire movie about framing devices. But so I was pleased as soon as, because, okay, to backtrack a little bit, one of the things I was wondering is, since this subject matter doesn't seem like something Ed would normally write about, will it even have any of the fun stuff that we look forward to when we're, because part of the fun is that that Ed's personality comes through in everything he does. It's irrepressible,
Right.
So that's why you can enjoy, dirty stories he wrote, or Plan 9 from Outer Space. Like, you can tell they're both by the same guy with the same weird, point of view and personality and all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing I was wondering, am I going to get this and it's going to be totally dry and devoid, and right out of the gate, the first clue is it's got a framing device, it's got a narrator, and occasionally the narrator even kind of has it's Ed Wood's voice, so obviously it's going to have his style, but a couple paragraphs by the narrator that you could totally hear Criswell or someone saying. I wrote one down later, but we'll get to that later. But in any case, yes, so it starts with the framing device, and it's funny because the framing device is that Bernard J. Williams is telling his son this story, and the son is written to seem very young, like, elementary school age or something. And as you get into the movie, when you're reminded that he's telling his son this stuff, it's funny because hello.
All right, make your appearance, Ivy, and then move on. Good to see Ivy. I know. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Lost my train of thought though.
He was a kid.
Oh yeah. So it's a funny framing device because when it starts getting into like, Frank messing around with girls and cheating on his wife and all this kind of stuff, plus lots of boring stuff about his career, you're like, when you think like, oh, this is being told to a child, it's funny when you remember that, because you're like, what kid would care about this stuff? But anyway.
Right.
So then it comes to like the Jesus Christ style birth of Frank Leahy, which is confusing because in the narration they make sure to call out he was born in Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
Then the very next scene cuts to him, I think like 6 years old or something. By now they've moved to South Dakota, Winner, South Dakota, which it's a big deal because Frank Leahy was all about winning. So he was the winner from Winner, and it's part of
har, with the winner from Winner. Yeah.
Part of his thing.
Right.
But Ed buries it. If you're reading the screenplay, you know what happened because it's just, they describe it in the scene headings or whatever. Within the actual dialogue and stuff, you'd still think they're living in Nebraska. Because one scene they say, he was born in Nebraska, and then cut to the very next scene, he's on a farm, all this kind of stuff. You would never think like, oh, they clearly moved, Later, they eventually mention Winner in passing, but it's a strange name for a town, so it would be confused. I mean, it's needlessly confusing, which I guess is another Ed trademark.
Yeah, right.
But clearly sort of a sign that this is a first draft. I'm assuming it's the only draft, but...
Agreed. Yeah, I think so too.
But, you could say, well, this is the kind of stuff that could be fixed in a later draft because you could point that out and then you could remedy it. But as it's written here, it does seem like it's just coming off the top of his head as he's looking at, some source material to where it makes sense to him. But if you go back and read over it, it doesn't connect all the dots. So.
Right. Exactly. And, it's nebulous to me. Again, having read the book, Frank, in the book, they moved to Winner when he's a very young child, and then subsequently things pretty much all transpire in Winner, South Dakota, as opposed to Nebraska. But there's talk a little bit later about we're going to send you back to Omaha, right, to go to go train with Denny Ryan to train to be a boxer. This is I'm getting ahead of myself, because let's go back to I'm being facetious here, but I halfway expected in the opening scene for Frank Leahy Sr. to walk out and hold the swaddling child to the sky and say, "Behold, something crazy," because that's how it's written. The air was still, and all of that. So in any case, when it tips off exactly where this is all going, more or less immediately right from the jump, because baby's born. Frank's dad, Frank Leahy Sr., walks in and he immediately pulls the blanket down to look at the hands. First off, the mother says, "You're going to be happy, Frank. It is a boy." So he clearly wanted a boy. And then he looks at the hands. He goes, "Ah, yes, he's got a boxer's hands." So this is like on the second page of the screenplay. So by this point, I'm already like, this is fantastic. This is so clearly Ed Wood. And matter of fact, the second line in the screenplay, first line is, I think, Bernie Williams' kid saying, "So did you really write a book about Frank Leahy, or did you really know who Frank Leahy was?" And Bernie Williams says, "You better believe it. You better believe it." Now, there's a couple times throughout the screenplay, other characters say, "You better believe it." And if you've read a lot of Ed paperbacks, just recently, last week, Joe Blevins and I reviewed What's After. In What's After, their characters once or twice will use exactly that phrase, "You better believe it." So to me, somebody who's read a whole ton of Ed Wood, immediately I'm like, oh, there's a phraseology that immediately ties this to Ed. And then the weird jumble of the geography, the framing device, and then we go just kind of on and on from there, almost nonstop for, it does start to meander and fall apart in the latter half. We'll get to that, but subsequently, the next big event in the screenplay, I guess, is the barn burning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So young Frank, his father's training him to be a boxer. He hates boxing, and the family goes off to go to church. So early on, there's a church reference. So I'm thinking, oh, is this like a religious movie? But doesn't turn out that it is, but it wouldn't be the first time Ed was hired by a church to do something. But in any case, they have to leave Frank behind with his sister because their carriage isn't big enough to take the whole family to church. So the sister stays home to take care of Frank. Frank sees a box of matches and goes in the barn and wants to burn his boxing gloves because he hates boxing. And instead, ends up burning down the entire barn, which they make sure to mention that it's the father's pride and joy, his barn. Right. in the community, it gives him standing in the community to have such a cool barn. Yeah. And so now Frank's burnt it down. The father comes back, says, "I'm never going to church again," because this is what happens when you go to church.
I didn't understand what Frank Leahy Sr. was getting at there. Was it that yes, I'm never going to go to church again because look what happens when I leave you kids alone? Or was it I could never show my face again in church because the standing in the community has been compromised because my barn's burnt down? Or am I just embarrassed? I don't understand why his sudden snap reaction to it is, "I'm never going to church again," and apparently he doesn't.
Yeah, he says later on, he prays and says, "Look, I didn't say I wasn't going to believe in God and pray and stuff. I'm just not physically going to go to church." So I think maybe he is afraid his house is going to burn down next if he goes, or
who knows, right? Yeah, exactly. So in the screenplay, that's actually one of the moments where there's a hand annotation where you can see very clearly that it's describing this incident to when Frank was, I think it says 5 or 6, and then it's hand annotated and it's written over 6 or 7. So this is when the other way around is when the barn burning happens. In the book, actually, the boxing glove angle is not present, and he just happens to burn the barn down at 3 years old. So quite interesting. In the screenplay, there's an element of deliberation, right? It's kind of a little bit nebulous. You could sort of be charitable in reading it and say, and it depends how, if this were ever made into a film, how they would emphasize things. Is he really just trying to burn up the boxing gloves? Because ritualistically he wants to be a football player. He wants to go to Notre Dame. He doesn't want to box. That's what his dad wants him to do, and it just happens to light up the barn. But it's deliberate, right? He knows he throws it on a pile of straw to make. So he's literally burning down his family barn.
True. And also, I guess the boxing gloves are in the barn because that's where they train. And so
Right.
he's burning down the place where they train.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but, uh, but actually, you brought up football and stuff. What's interesting is at this point in the screenplay, uh, they still haven't mentioned. I mean, at the beginning, it's clear that this is a movie about football. But then, as soon as it goes into Frank's life, it goes straight to the boxing and burning down the barn and everything. All that stuff happens before anyone mentions that Frank loves Notre Dame or that he wants to play football or anything. Um, and that's one of the through lines of at least the first half that kept blowing my mind, that Ed avoided mentioning football as much as possible. Like anytime anything sports related comes up for like the first 30 pages or something like that, um, it's always basketball or boxing or anything. And then finally, when someone finally mentions that Frank is good at football, it's his brother, and it's just in a line of dialogue. You by now you've seen him box, you've seen him play basketball, you've seen him interact with his basketball coach, and they talk about maybe getting a scholarship and stuff.
Mhm.
But it's all you think on a rewrite. Hey, let's just every time when you have the basketball practice, just make it football practice.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. But it's strange.
We never get like a scene at the high school football game where he, does something heroic and wins the game. We never get anything of that sort, right? In fact,
Mm.
yeah, you're right. It's we really don't get him onto a football field until the moment when he comes at full gallop
Yeah.
up to Knute Rockne. So we'll get to that. That's a rather odd scene, obviously.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, so his boxing career, his dad wants him to be a
Right.
boxer. His dad says, I want you to be a tradesman or learn something that you can do that you can make a living doing, or be a boxer, or you should be a
Right.
boxer because that's going to
Right.
apparently be much more lucrative. Football, you're not going to make a living playing football, and put those thoughts out of your head of Notre Dame this, Notre Dame that. So there's a frictional relationship between he and his dad, and so conversely, then there's this more empathetic viewpoint that his mother takes towards his aspirations.
Uh-huh. Well, what else is interesting about that is, even if, let's say this is true, right? The interesting thing is it does not make a very dramatic movie if your problem with your father is he wants you to play one sport and you want to play the other sport.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, maybe if it's your life, that's a big deal when you're a teenager or whatever. A dramatic movie would be like your dad hates sports and doesn't want you involved in it at all, and you defy him and play sports, or the other way around, you don't want to play sports at all and your family makes you play
Yeah.
sports. You know what I mean? So right there, it's like splitting hairs. Like, I mean, I know boxing and football is very different, and there's a lot of reasons why you might prefer one sport over the other, especially if it's you getting punched in the face and stuff. Uh, but dramatically in a screenplay form, it's like your kid aspires to go to a good college and play sports on a well-known team that
Right.
you know that's your biggest problem in life is like it's like just let him go.
Yeah, he's insistent upon the boxing to the point where his dad has a surprise for him one day. He says, "I
Right.
got a surprise for you," and then we cut to the next scene, and
Yeah.
it's Frank is set up in a boxing match with a guy named first he's named Silent Joe Blaha, and
Yeah.
that's actually the real gentleman's name. Uh,
Hmm.
Very quickly, Ed starts to call him Bala and spells it a
Hmm.
couple of different ways. And it's not a lengthy scene, but they're fighting. It's a boxing match in a barn. If somebody can take down Silent Joe Blaha, they're going to win $100.
Hmm.
So Ed's I'm calling Frank Ed just like you did. That's
Yeah, I did
interesting, right?
that.
That's interesting. So anyway, Frank is fighting Silent Joe Blaha, in a kind of barn fight, one of these local type of things. But Silent Joe Blaha, because we both looked him up, he actually had a very brief professional career. You'll find that he had three what are considered professional fights. He lost them all. He's
Yeah.
called Silent Joe Blaha, and this is revealed in the screenplay also, and it was the case in real life because he is a deaf mute, in fact. Um, and it's that aspect of things that leads to Frank ultimately winning the fight because Silent Joe doesn't hear the bell and continues to pummel Frank, so Frank wins on a technicality. Because, in matter of fact, Silent Joe Blaha's beaten the crap out of him through the fight up until that point. Frank is called Frank. Did you make anything of the fact that he was called Frank Kane? His boxing nom de
No,
plume.
I mean, there's a quick mention that when they announced Frank Kane, he doesn't
Right.
he forgot he's going by a pseudonym, so he doesn't react right away. But I believe when I was reading about it, Kane was his mother's maiden name, or
Oh, okay.
there's a Kane in the family somewhere.
Okay, that makes sense.
I think Ed spells it wrong, but
Yeah, Cane. It's probably Kane. Yeah.
it might be.
Yeah.
I can't. I should have written that down, but there's someone in the family named Kane.
Okay.
Or maybe a middle name or something. I'm not sure. But in any case, yeah, I guess that's his stage name, his boxing name.
Right.
And they now, okay, so we were just talking, or you guys, last couple episodes talking about the Watts books. And in this section, I noticed Ed emphasizes the darkness of Silent Joe.
Yeah.
Blah. And I was wondering, I was like, why is he fixating on this specifically? I don't know, maybe in the book they fixated on it or something. But he seemed preoccupied with it. And I was wondering if it's a race thing, but then you were saying you didn't really pick up, you didn't really think that was the case.
Interesting. My initial impression, it didn't hit me that way. I didn't think twice about it, and when we talked about it, I subsequently realized on another scan of the book, it's mentioned in the book that he has very, very dark skin. I don't think I told you this, so it's mentioned in the book that he has extremely dark skin, but that he is not in fact black, that he's been out in the sun a lot.
Oh, okay.
Which
interesting.
Interesting, because
Yeah.
I went so far as to type in, Blaha, what's the actual lineage of that name, and it's a name that seems to hail from Czechoslovakia or Russia most commonly. So yeah, but in the screenplay, yeah, you just mentioned his darkness, and it does. I agree with you. In retrospect, it does leave it open. If you were going to base your film on the screenplay, you very well may cast a black guy to play Joe Blaha based strictly on what's written.
Yeah, and I was actually, when I first Googled, I originally Googled it to figure out if he's a real guy, and two, if he's a real guy, which spelling of his name is correct, Blaha or Bala. And in doing so, I was hoping I'd see a picture, because Ed goes out of his way to say he's like the ugliest, meanest looking guy. And obviously couldn't find anything except for his record, but no pictures or anything.
Right. I couldn't find any evidence that Frank Kane ever really went anywhere in the boxing world either. So he does ultimately get a scholarship to Notre Dame, and he's wildly excited. There is a sweet moment. I think it's a really sweet moment when first his mom says, she tucks a $20 bill in his shirt pocket. As soon as he announces that he's gotten a scholarship, she goes, "Don't let your dad know about this." And she walks out of the room. Dad walks in and stuffs many bills into his pocket and says, "Don't let your mom know about this." And Ed describes it as, and Frank put his hand over his dad's hand on the table. It's really the sweetest moment in their relationship in the whole entire book by far. Subsequently, it's interesting because his dad, you can look, if you know Ed's work fairly well, that the dad figure, generally speaking, is not one that there's a lot of warmth towards. Think of Glenn or Glenda. He depicts his dad as kind of the blowhard at the bar, played, of course, by the great Captain DeZita, who also plays the devil. He also plays the devil in that movie. So think about that for a second. So think about Ed's attitude towards fathers, and then think about his attitude towards mothers generally. And I think it infuses the characters in the book. His relationship with his dad is nowhere near as frictional. His dad does want him to be a boxer, but he's not so committed to it that he's literally willing to sort of almost disown his son, because his initial reaction to it when he realizes his son's going to go to Notre Dame when he gets the scholarship is, I'm not going to give you anything, not even money for transportation,
right?
Which leads to his mode of transport to get to Notre Dame, which is one of the best scenes, quite frankly, in the whole screenplay in my mind.
Right. Well, that was one of the first things. They mentioned Frank's horse early on and call it Lightning,
right?
And that was one of the first things where I thought, man, is this just Ed loves Westerns and he wants to he's like, well, it's a farm. There's a horse named Lightning, you know, or is it literally in the book? They talk all about how Frank has a horse named Lightning. And then I wanted to know even more because what you're leading up to is that in the screenplay, Frank literally rides his horse Lightning from Winter, South Dakota,
Right.
all the way to Notre Dame, right onto the football field, right up to Knute Rockne, and says, "Hey, I'm here."
Right. In the middle of a practice session. In the middle of a practice session. Yeah.
And you know, I don't know. I thought, who knows? So I looked it up, and that's like today, with the way roads are and stuff today, you could probably make that drive in 12 or 13 hours. But riding a horse across country, I mean, it'd be several days at least, and doesn't seem very likely that this actually happened. And and even then, when he gets there, they're all stunned that he rode a horse all the way there, and he says, "I've ridden Lightning even farther." And I'm thinking,
right.
where'd you go?
In the book, he talks about riding Lightning on these jobs, like day jobs and stuff like that, as a laborer when he was younger, where he would ride Lightning, 125 miles in the course of a single day and things like that. Huh? So there's a little bit more of that in the book, but this is where, for me, where the whole I get so fascinated by the minutia and the ephemeral details, and I like to dive into them. This is where this becomes so much fun for me. It's always fun for me, but it became so much fun for me to really dig into this aspect of things. And we were back and forth on this, Paul and I, last night, actually. I'm not real good at math, so it took me a little bit to sort of get my head wrapped around how long would it take him via horseback to get from Winter to South Bend, Indiana. And yeah, about something like a 678-mile trek. So a horse can, at galloping speed, go 25 to 30 miles per hour. Again, this is what's fun about it. I don't know anything about, how fast horses actually can gallop or canter or trot. And now I know these things, so you learn things along the way that you didn't expect to learn, which is fun. But let's presume his name is Lightning. Right, his name's Lightning, so let's presume he goes at least 30 miles an hour.
Right.
Again, you do the math on this. It's days and days of, even if he were at full gallop 24/7, it would take something like 40 hours to get there, give or take. Again, you've checked my math, and I'm probably wrong. But point here being, and how would he have boarded the horse? How would it fed the horse, taken care of the horse along route? Because it's not like you just hop on the horse, you just ride and ride and ride. And
right.
So it's it's a scene that it makes no rational sense. Is it dramatic? It's dramatic as hell, because the players are practicing, and then they all start to sort of stop and look around because they hear this far-flung galloping of hooves, and then they realize, who is this guy tearing down the field towards us on a horse? Incidentally, in the book, the horse it comes up early in the screenplay and is mentioned around the farm on a couple of occasions. But the horse is not mentioned in the book whatsoever until this scene happens. And this scene does happen in the book, but the horse is never given the name Lightning either in the book. Lightning, so I had to, of course, dig into that a little bit. And Lightning is Tim Holt's horse. So Tim Holt, of course, was Western star that Ed would have been very, very familiar with. Probably familiar with Tim's horse being Lightning. So that gets us all the way to the first interaction with The Rock.
Yep. And actually, although real quick, though, it just occurred to me, we didn't talk about the Four Horsemen at all.
Oh, right.
And I don't even, they're four famous football guys that were on the team back when Knute Rockne was coaching. Yeah. They were called the Four Horsemen. And so maybe that's part of it. Maybe the Frank Leahy legend is that he rode a horse onto the field because of the Four Horsemen. He's the new horseman, maybe. I don't know.
That's interesting.
That might be a connection.
It definitely is, actually, I would think, because, the Four Horsemen are writ large in Notre Dame lore, from my recent understanding, to a huge extent. Go ahead.
I was just saying, and then there's the Don Miller thing, right?
Yeah, there's the Don Miller thing. So there's a whole lot of weirdness in this whole Four Horsemen thing. So the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse football. This plays itself out a little bit more in the book than it does in the screenplay. But up until Knute Rockne had this idea that we could get guys who were fast and leaner, who had quote unquote trimmer ankles. Up until that point, it was a game where it was just big guys who just smashed each other and just tried to bust through each other. There wasn't even really a passing game. Knute was kind of instrumental to a degree in starting the concept of a passing game. In fact, the ball was almost round originally. It wasn't really made to even be thrown downfield. By the time Frank is coaching, he has one of the greatest Notre Dame quarterbacks of all time working for him. Johnny Lujack, I think won a Heisman, as a matter of fact. But anyway, and that's another piece. Leahy turned out a number of a handful of Heisman Trophy winners as well to add to his rather storied record. But anyway, going back to the Four Horsemen. So that was Don Miller, Stoldreyer. I can't remember the gentleman's first name. Stoldreyer, Sleepy Jim Crowley, and Elmer Layden. Elmer Layden became a Notre Dame coach in the 1930s himself. And in fact, I don't know if it's in the screenplay or the book, but at one point somebody's talking to, it was the first time he meets Father Kavanaugh. So I think this must be in the screenplay. He's talking to Father Kavanaugh. Father Kavanaugh says, there might be an opening at Notre Dame. And Frank's like, Father, I'd love to coach at Notre Dame, but there's no way. There's just no way that that's going to happen. Thanks. And just got a fresh beer delivered to me. You can't beat that, right?
No, you can't.
You can't. So Stoldreyer, Layden, going back to Elmer Layden. So he's the coach at Notre Dame. He decides to end up taking the job as the first commissioner of the NFL, which opened. Frank thought to himself when he's talking to Father Kavanaugh, he'll never leave Notre Dame. He was one of the Four Horsemen. Why would he ever leave the coaching gig, the best coaching gig in the world, at Notre Dame? But yeah, Elmer Layden became the first commissioner of the NFL, opening up the gig for Frank to step into and ultimately become the coach. But anyway, if we wind back a little bit, Frank ended up playing with a few of the Four Horsemen. They were in their later years, and he in his earlier years as a Notre Dame football player. But they won the Four Horsemen. I believe it was 1926, won the national championship. I think it was Knute's first national championship. But Knute made it relatively well known. These guys, if you average their weight, all four of them average out to a weight of 157 pounds. Don Miller, who you mentioned, was 5'8". So he was reconceptualizing. I guess if you love football, you know all this, and you probably think, yes, he reconceptualized the whole entire game, right? He turned it from a game of what was, power and brute force into a game that was inclusive of, speed and dexterity and all of these other elements. But the Four Horsemen was also part of Knute's 7 and 4, so 7 on the line and 4 in the backfield. Again, very new stuff from what I understand at the time in the game of football. Real quick side note. So after a month or so ago, after I'd written that first article about Frank Leahy, I was talking to one of my best friends one day, and I said, hey, you ever heard, and he knows a lot about absolutely everything. He's a little bit older than I, very, very seasoned gentleman. And I said, have you ever heard of Frank Leahy? And he goes, yeah, I kind of know Frank Leahy was the Notre Dame coach. Do you know what? When I was a kid growing up, Sleepy Jim Crowley, one of the Four Horsemen, lived in town, and I used to see him on the streets walking around. Everybody knew who Sleepy Jim was. He wandered around town, and he was kind of like a little bit of an actual local legend. And yeah, everybody knew the Four Horsemen. He's talking about growing up as a kid in the 1950s and 60s in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that, right? and there's a contingent of people who think highly still, generations later, of the Four Horsemen as being these legendary Notre Dame football players. Of course, that of course leads to the notion that Notre Dame is not. You don't have to have been a Notre Dame alumni, and in some ways, it's almost portrayed in the world. And you can go into any sporting goods store and you'll find all kinds of Notre Dame gear everywhere. The Notre Dame is kind of the world's football team in some weird way, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they've been committed to this win at all costs, and this tradition of excellence for so many years. I mean, if you do dig into it, it is kind of interesting. They did turn out a ridiculous amount of Heisman Trophy winners throughout the course of the last now going on 200 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, about 150 years of football, realistically.
Yeah. Well, the interesting, tying it back to Ed, you had noted, so one of the Four Horsemen was Don Miller. And then in Ed's adult movie, Necromania, his directing credit is Don Miller.
Don Miller.
And the question is that a clue that Ed cares about
Yeah.
Notre Dame football, or who knows where that pseudonym came from? But
Right.
it is interesting coincidence that he wrote the Frank Leahy legend and then also directed a film where he used the name Don Miller.
It is bizarre.
Who
It's
knows?
bizarre. It's a fairly common name, right? Generic name, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, you sort of, as you get deeper into woodology, as I like to call it, these kinds of coincidences don't ultimately sort of seem like coincidences, because the whole story, the whole story around Ed Wood ends up being rife with all this rather odd, wonderful little. Even if it is a coincidence, it's a wonderful little coincidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so now we get to the point. Let's see. So he's playing for Notre Dame, and
Yes.
he's a tackle, and he it blows right through it, right? We allied this time. There's a couple snippets of a couple key games that he played in during this time frame. The screenplay is more interested in sort of his relationship with Knute than it is what was happening on the football field, I think.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that's very true. And during this sequence is the first time in the screenplay that Ed mentioned stock footage. And anyone who's into Ed Wood knows the use of stock footage is a big, the Stampede and Glen or Glenda, the
Right, right.
Octopus and Bride of the Monster. And obviously, you can say every movie. I mean, stock footage is a thing. It's not an Ed Wood thing, but it is one of the things you think about when you think about Ed Wood. And interesting specifically to write it into the screenplay. It's in a scene where they're watching game film, where Knute Rockne is showing game film to his athletes, and so Ed mentions that to use stock footage for the game film, and it made me wonder. Whatever the circumstances were that got him to write this screenplay, if he was hired by someone to write it, did they say to him, "Hey, write this on a budget. Be budget conscious when you write this, so that we
Yeah.
can produce it." Or is it just Ed? That's he's used to doing it that way. This is the way I would do it, so therefore I'm going to tell you to do it this way in the screenplay. Or did he not even think twice about it? Who knows? But
Right.
when I get it and I'm wondering, is there going to be Ed Wood stuff in here? That's the kind of thing, get to page 40 and it goes stock footage. And I think, that's Ed Wood, right?
Right. Right, for sure. The screenplay actually ends with a very, very detailed number of pages that detail all the different characters, bit players,
Mm-hmm.
extras, as well as all the interior and exterior locations. And when you look at it in the aftermath of having read the screenplay, you're like, wow, it's pretty extensive. So
Yeah.
if you were going to make this movie, or if you were going to make the screenplay into a movie, uh, you'd have a lot of setups. You'd have a lot of people involved. You could make this movie on the cheap, and you can make a piece of garbage, or you can make this movie, and try to do it justice and spend quite a
Mm-hmm.
bit of money on it, and probably ultimately result in I don't want to say a piece of garbage, but
Mm-hmm.
it's so hokey. Like, all the dramatics are very hokey, and again, I don't have this great affinity for this win at all costs sort of a Notre Dame notion. So
Right.
that being said, I would love to absolutely see this made into a movie. There again, though, there are moments, admittedly, there are moments like the moment I talked about between Frank and his dad, and there are other moments that are affecting. So it's not awful by any means. It is, again, to
Right.
your point, first draft that could have been cleaned up and made a bit better, but it has that stilted feel of Ed's work, generally
Mm-hmm.
speaking, where it's again, the dramatics come across to me as a bit hokey and
Mm-hmm.
very it feels very old fashioned for having been
Mm-hmm.
written in 1975.
Yes, that's for sure. I mean, it's like you picture like Pride of the Yankees or
Hmm.
uh, something. I mean, obviously that's regarded as a good movie, but uh, but yeah, you picture like Americana, growing up on the farm and all that kind of stuff. It's very Hollywood for the first half or so, and then Ed kind of either he's running out of I don't know exactly what happened. It's either he starts off with ambition and thinks I'm really going to dramatize everything. This is going to be great. I'm going to turn all this stuff into scenes with beginnings, middles, and ends. I'm going to have characters and character moments, etc. Does that for like 30 pages, 40 pages, 50 pages, and then gets into Frank's adult life, and it's very much hurriedly skipping through stuff as if you're
Right.
checking off a checklist. I don't know if it's like, oh no, I spent too much time on this other stuff, I better hurry up and get, or if it's like, oh, I'm sick of this, let me get this over with, or if it's like, I only halfway even understand what they're talking. I mean, I
Right.
only don't care about and don't understand what I'm adapting, and so I'm gonna skip over it as quickly as possible, or I'm doing this in one sitting and I'm drunk now. Like,
So so we're getting yes, we're getting as we approach sort of the midpoint of the screenplay, yeah, the tenor and tone is going to change. And for me personally, yeah, it's more sloppily written as we get into the latter half of the book, and it starts to get a little bit meandering and all over the map. I love it. This is where some of the funnier things that happen in the screenplay happen in my mind. But just to sort of tie a bow on the football career of Frank Leahy,
yeah,
because what ultimately happens is Frank takes ill at the end of a game around 1954 as a pancreatitis attack, and he's literally read his last rites at the hospital. They read him his last rites. The doctor says he's not going to last much longer, and they have a press conference and say, the doctor even says, Frank Leahy has been read his last rites, and this is where one of the crazier things that happens in the whole entire screenplay happens is they leave Frank alone on his deathbed while they go have this press conference. So the janitor, Patrick, the janitor, sneaks into the room, and he opens Frank's mouth and pours a little bit of whiskey down his throat in his flask, and that sort of brings Frank back to life in some
yeah,
strange, weird way. Patrick, yes, his name's Patrick. He's listed as quote unquote the elderly janitor, right? The elderly
yes,
janitor.
yes, and Ed makes sure to have all of Patrick's dialogue as he monologues to himself be written in a clearly Irish type of accent.
Brogue. Yeah, he even mentions it. He's speaking in an Irish brogue, right? So,
Yeah,
uh,
and this is the first time he pops. So this magical janitor comes in, revives Frank with liquor, and it's a memorable scene. But it's the kind of thing where on the second draft you might plant the janitor in some other scenes. Like
prior to
he's
that,
like works around the school or something like that. I don't know.
right, right. So Frank surviving on his death. Well, actually, Frank survives his deathbed here. It's mentioned later on that he had been given the last rites on a couple subsequent occasions. In the book, actually, he really did slog it out for the last 20 years of his life against all odds to try to hang in there. Of course, we mentioned Bernie Williams' wife Donna. There's a death scene there. Um, there is the Knute Rockne, although we don't, the plane crash happens. That's actually Ed tries to paint that picture. We're good backtracking, chronologically a little bit here to Knute Rockne's plane crash, I think 1931, but that's he tries to portray that cinematically in the screenplay. Not something
Yeah.
he gets into a whole lot. Yeah, does he say, it's an interior shot, it's a medium shot, he doesn't get into a lot of blocking in the screenplay, but he does in
Mhm.
that scene.
Yes. Well, that one's so there's that transition, and there's another transition earlier where Frank is listening to Knute coach, and Ed makes sure to mention that it's you're tight on Frank's face as he listens to Knute Rockne, and then it
Yeah,
dissolves to later Frank in Newt's office, and in a scene like that, you can picture what he's saying, and you can see the movie. It's one of the few times you can see the movie in your head, and and so there's little flashes like that where you're like, oh, he is trying to think cinematically, even though there's tons of telling and not
yeah,
showing all over the screenplay. Every now and then there's a little transition. So when Knute Rockne dies, it's similar. In the scene preceding his death, you start to hear. Ed mentions you can hear on the soundtrack the engines of the plane fading up, and they get louder and louder. And in an unrelated scene, where I don't know, Knute is talking to Frank or something, and the engines get louder and louder, and you're thinking, what is this engines? And then cut to Frank's no, sorry, Knute Rockne's funeral, and it talks about how he died in a plane crash and stuff. And so that isn't the other like strikingly cinematic moment where Ed is thinking about the sound design,
Right.
the visuals, the transition from one sequence to another. That's juxtaposed with scenes, haphazardly cobbled together with no care at all as to how
Right.
narratively things translate. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that it pops up like that.
It's funereal, right? Generally speaking, again, that's there's a heavy, and that's commonplace for Ed's work, generally speaking. But that reminds me, as you were describing it, not vastly dissimilar to sort of the cinematic manner of presentation in Plan 9 when Bella's character, when his wife dies, right? It happens off screen,
Mm-hmm.
and it transpires almost immediately, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unexpectedly.
Actually, it's funny you mention that because this sequence also reminded me of two things. It bore a striking resemblance to the beginning of Citizen Kane, and we know that Ed loves Orson Welles, right? So after Knute Rockne dies, there's a montage of newspaper articles talking about how he's dead. There's, I think, like radio announcers talking about him being dead. Kind of a montage in a way that the rest of the movie doesn't have that kind of stuff. Montage of like a multimedia montage, and then Frank sitting alone in a screening room watching film of Knute Rockne, which again is evocative after the opening of Citizen Kane, where it goes through, where it's like a newsreel talking about Kane's death and then going through his whole life and then getting back to his death again. Then it cuts to the guys who make the newsreels sitting in the screening room watching the screen. And so I can only think Ed must be picturing, this kind of shot. And then it reminded me of the Tim Burton film Ed Wood, where like you're talking about Bela Lugosi in Plan 9, where in the film Ed Wood, after Bela Lugosi dies, Ed has this footage he shot of Lugosi that gets used in Plan 9 later. And in the Tim Burton film, he's sitting in a screening room that's lit, black and white, and lit very similarly to the way it's lit in Citizen Kane, watching this one reel of film over and over of Bela Lugosi. And, so of course there's that similarity. And this is first half of the screenplay is about, Frank being mentored by Knute Rockne and how much that relationship means to him, and how it's like a substitute father figure and all that kind of stuff. And then going into the Citizen Kane stuff, and then reminding me of the Tim Burton movie. It's like it all kind of comes together in that Rockne death sequence.
Cool. That's cool. Good catches, by the way, to stitch all that together, because and that's commonplace for Ed too. That's what for us. I don't want to speak for you, Paul, but I suspect you'll agree with this statement. The deeper you get into Ed's work, and the more you avail yourself of it across a bunch of different media channels, not only watching his films, but reading his screenplays and reading his articles in sex magazines, reading photo captions in adult paperbacks. The more you aggregate all this material, you realize that he has such an auteurist quality. Right, like the common notion of the film auteur, who has all these themes and obsessions, which I think it was Fellini who said I just make the same movie over and over again. Right, right, and it's very much the case, I think, with Ed as you really get deeper into it.
Yeah, you cannot stop him from putting his own personality into whatever he's working on. And I mean, in one way, it's a survival mechanism. Like if I'm doing all this work for hire that I don't want to do, maybe at least I can entertain myself by, putting this in or that in, or this thing I like or that thing I like. But also, it's like if you, have creative ambitions, you want to tell your stories, and if the only way to do it is by shoehorning it into the Frank Leahy legend or into a sex paperback or whatever, then so be it, I guess. But actually that brings up something I wanted to talk about. I mean, I know we kind of only partway chronologically through the screenplay, but Speaking of Ed Wood's personality and his tastes and his auteur qualities and that kind of stuff, like I said, one of the things I was wondering when I first got my hands on this is there going to be fun stuff that you can say, yep, that's Ed Wood, all right, or is it going to be it was for hire, he couldn't get any of that stuff in there? Of course, the thing other than filmmaking Ed Wood is most famous for is that he liked to wear women's clothing, and to me that's a big part of what makes him an outsider artist. Is that's a unique point of view for a film director to be bringing that into everything he does. And I thought, well, there's no way if he's writing a screenplay about a real guy based on a book about a real guy, and it's about football and it's macho and so on and so forth, you can't sneak that stuff in here. And so when you do stuff like this, it's tempting to be a little too analytical or make connections that maybe aren't there, or make a little bit of a stretch, but in another way, that's literary analysis is all about that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
I thought it was very interesting. I mentioned earlier they avoid football as much as possible. I think, I don't know. Well, whatever. Frank doesn't end up on a football field until 30 pages into it. They don't show him actually playing a game until 50 pages into it or something like that.
Yeah.
But the first time he does anything football related outside of dialogue is having a playful game of catch outside of a party. There's a prohibition
speakeasy
era
type of place.
And he's a bouncer there, and he bounces a guy and gets beat up, and but a couple girls and one of his buddies who is introduced like he's going to be a big character and then never appears in the screenplay again, they're fooling around out on the street, and him and his buddy start playing pass, like, hey, we're football players, let's play pass, have a game of pass. And what they are passing is one of the girls' shoes. They take, in loving detail, Ed describes how they take the shoe off of the girl's foot and then they pass it back and forth. So in any other screenplay, you might say, well, whatever, that's a fun, it's more fun than just showing guys chucking a football around, make it a interesting character moment, use the things that are in the scene around you, set things, don't just put everything on a football field, set it somewhere else. But in this one, it's supposedly all about football, and there hasn't been any football in it yet. The very first time Frank Leahy throws a football, it's actually a woman's shoe. And so since this is Ed Wood writing this, I mean, it's like paradise for me when I'm thinking, is there even going to be any Ed Wood in this? And then I get to the shoe passing scene, I'm like, well, there's Ed Wood. I mean, right. Football, it's like an analogy. Football is to Frank Leahy as women's clothing is to Ed Wood,
Right, exactly. And that's why, to be fair, both of us made the subconscious mistake earlier in this very episode where we referred to Frank as Ed.
Right.
And so having read through it and you start to really identify with the character of Frank, you start to understand there are proxies. How is Ed going to be even remotely interested in writing about this guy, you would think, on the surface? But he finds these proxies within Frank's bio to be able to relate to. And I think that's and to customize it to a degree, right? Personalize it and jam in some of his own themes and motifs. I think we're at a point now, Paul, where we're getting into the latter half of the book, and we start to jump a little bit into a few different directions, and a lot of weird and sort of interesting things happen. I do want to comment though, because he's a bouncer, right, at a speakeasy. He says, I'm not a very good bouncer. I don't have a good jaw to be a boxer. This is why he wants to go play football. But on a couple of occasions, we see Frank, get the crap kicked out of him. We see that happen not only to Joe Blaha until the bell rings, is laying a beating on him. And he mentions getting beat up a few times as a bouncer. And there's scenes, and you pointed this out to me, that scenes where he gets hit and then he's spitting out his teeth, and it happens two or three times, and it happens even more times actually in the book. In the book, he mentions that that job I had as a bouncer, that was like a habitual occurrence where I found myself spitting out my teeth, which is interesting because, of course, we know that Ed lost his teeth somehow along the
Yeah.
way, but we
Right.
don't exactly know how. The Unknown War of Ed Wood, written by Jim Pontilillo, makes a supposition about that, how it happened
Mm.
in the war, which I think is a very credible supposition.
Yeah.
But you were the one who reminded me of that.
Yeah. When you're searching for these connections, I mean, I'm sure being a boxer, he probably got his teeth knocked out once or twice, but yeah, trying to connect it to Ed, I thought, well, I mean, he can relate. I mean, not only to because Leahy later was in the military
Right,
during World War II, just
right.
like Ed.
In the
Uh,
Pacific,
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
scoping out the islands, very
yeah,
similar. Yeah,
yeah. So there's that, and then plus Ed, part of the Ed lore is that he had his front teeth knocked out. So uh, just another little connection there. I don't
yeah,
know.
right.
Doesn't probably mean anything, but it is an interesting connection.
It is. It is interesting. So going back to the speakeasies or beer halls or something like that. These in the book, you don't have a lot of scenes happening in places like that. So those are all things that happen in the screenplay. So
Mm,
Ed likes these settings, obviously. So Frank's father ultimately passes away, and in this book, it's mere mention in a couple of sentences that he was mugged, and that was it. He was mugged and
mm,
killed. In the screenplay, it has him, at a kind of a beer hall hanging out, and it's some other unsavory characters note that he's got lots of money on him, so they
mm,
follow him out after he leaves, and they beat him to death. And interestingly enough, it's the one time in the book where he's talking to the, I believe, the bartender, and he's saying, wish I had gone and seen my kid's game. I couldn't do it. He was supposed to go see Frank play, and it would have been the
mm,
only time, presumably, that he ever saw Frank play, when Frank was at Notre Dame. But he
mm.
says a few positive things about Frank and Frank's success in football, just before, of course, he's
Yeah,
ultimately attacked and killed
yeah,
shortly thereafter. But again, that's a moment, a little bit of a healing moment in the relationship.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because he's both being a bad father and a good father at the same time.
Yeah,
Because just leading up to that, um, there's a bunch of talk from Frank about he's injured and he probably shouldn't play, but he knows his family, including his father, are going to come watch, and so he's going to
yeah,
play anyway because it's really important to him. And then his dad doesn't even show up, but when he does listen to it on the radio at a bar, and does say the nice things you said he says. So it's like he doesn't show up to the game that Frank kind of sacrifices himself to play in, but he does begrudgingly say he's proud of his son after listening to it at the bar, but then is
right.
immediately rewarded by being murdered by these guys when he's walking down the street. Which is another thing. It's interesting the stuff Ed chooses to linger on as opposed to the stuff that he skips over. You might get to a bunch of dialogue talking about how important this upcoming game is, and then there's one line that says insert football montage, and then it moves on. But if you're at a speakeasy, there's like a description this long about all the different ways people, oh, this is prohibition, so women have flasks in their garter belts and
Exactly.
men are sneaking drinks, and you drink this way or you drink that way, or
Right,
all this
right.
stuff about drinking, clearly important to Ed. And then later, similarly, when the father gets beaten to death, again, there's like a dramatized sequence that takes up, I don't know, half a page, maybe a full page, explaining the violence in great detail, which is reminiscent of some of his short stories. Um, and so it's clear here, oh, I'm in my element. A guy is getting mugged and beat up and stuff.
Yeah.
This is like noir, film noir or whatever. But when it comes to football, whatever, football game, a football game happened. Let's move on.
Right. And there's an inordinate amount of drinking in the book, right?
Yeah,
Like everybody drinks, everybody pours a drink pretty much all the time. At one point, is it his wife,
yeah,
right, develops because he's on the road all the time. She
mm-hmm,
attributes it to that he's away all the time and she's alone and she's raising all these kids, and the stress of it has led her to develop a drinking problem,
mm-hmm,
which is kind of interesting because that's not something that commonly Ed would really get into.
mm-hmm,
Drinking's never really a problem. Characters in most of his literature just do it nonstop all the time.
mm-hmm,
Um, but I would assume, again, that's probably a real biological or a real biographical element
mm-hmm,
to the story where, at some point along the way, Frank's wife
mm-hmm.
probably maybe did develop a drinking problem. Ultimately, what do they end up having? 8 kids I think
I can't remember, but it's a lot.
it just keeps adding up as we go through the latter half of the book. They seem to have more and more kids, and they seem to have a genuine relationship early on.
Yeah.
He calls her name is Florence Riley, and they meet and hit it off immediately, and ultimately get married. He when does he put the ring on her? It's at the showing of the jazz singer, isn't it?
Well, no. So it's at the movies. I
At the
can't remember
movies.
which movie they're at, but
Okay.
earlier on, Frank is on a date with
Oh
he's
yeah,
college
yeah.
age. He's on a date with another girl, and actually, this also reads well a couple things. One, it's very Ed Wood because suddenly in a movie about sports, we get several page long scene about watching a movie in a movie theater. So clearly Ed's heart is with movies and not with sports, right?
Right.
He can identify with someone enjoying a movie. And in that sequence, it's supposed to be comical that Frank can't pay attention to the girl he's on a date with who really, 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 Ed goes over the top explaining how excited she is to be like making out with him at the movie, which is another thing where that when you read that, it reads like, his sex stories basically. And you start thinking, who is he writing this for? But in any case, Frank can't pay attention to her because he's blown away because he's watching the jazz singer, and it's the first sound film he's ever seen before. And he didn't, I guess he, according to the screenplay, thought he's going into a silent movie and then is amazed partway through when Al Jolson starts talking and singing.
Right.
And so amazed that he can't even pay attention to his date, who then ends up, the guy sitting behind them ends up making out with her because,
Oh yeah.
And then in a similar scene, 100 pages later, he's with his soon-to-be wife at a movie, and he proposes to her and puts a ring on her finger. And Ed even dramatizes and romanticizes the light from the projector flickering on them,
Right.
and all that kind of stuff, which is very Ed Woody of him to do. And again, there's a guy sitting behind them in the theater, but he's just he keeps on, hey, keep it down, I'm trying to watch the movie, and I guess it's supposed to be a little bit of humor. But it's interesting how the movies pop at that scene. The movie pops up in like an important milestone. Now maybe it's true, maybe he proposed to her at a movie theater, or maybe Ed was like, what better place to set this than a movie theater.
Well, I know. I think you describe it brilliantly, Paul, because I think what you're talking about here is a couple scenes that are, again, see, I mashed it together in my head, but yeah, they're two distinct scenes, separate and apart from each other on the narrative timeline. But yeah, he's building off of same kind of themes and building off of same kind of locations and things like that to build up his characters. That's fascinating. I completely forgot. Actually, yeah, there's the one guy in this latter scene griping, keep it down. But in the first scene, yeah, the first scene is probably one of the closest anywhere in the screenplay that we get to any kind of real genuine sexuality, right? Where he describes the girl as really getting turned on and she really wants it bad and she's really hot and heavy. And then Mammy comes on and Frank loses complete interest in her at that point. And yeah, the gentleman sitting behind them, I guess she says something to him, says something to him and he doesn't even respond. So the gentleman sitting behind them leans over and says, well, I can help you out. And she literally just walks away with him.
Mm-hmm.
And Frank doesn't even notice. Frank does, because he is, of course, portrayed in some way, shape, or form as a bit of a ladies' man.
Yeah, so that was a big thing when I was reading it. I was early on and often throughout the screenplay. Ed focuses on Frank hooking up with different women. And it made me wonder, like, is this how the book is? I mean, is it constantly saying Frank was having all these conquests with women? Or is this Ed, he's so, I don't know, preoccupied with women and or used to writing these sex stories that it's like, well, I got to fill pages. What am I going to do? Oh, let's have a scene where Frank, hooks up with someone. And then again, you wonder, who is this written for? Right. Is this like something he had to check off the list, or is this like he turned this in and then Bernie Williams or whoever read it and thought, I can't we can't do anything with this. What do you? I mean, he got it copywritten, so
Exactly. Right.
there's that. But there's even a scene later on. We mentioned early on in this that Ed will say to the director's discretion when there's like an action scene or a football scene or even like a big crowd scene. It'll say like a brief description, but let's leave it up to the director. You can do what you want with this. And one of the only time there's a sex scene or an almost sex scene partway through where Frank is hooking up with someone, and I think it might be the woman who's saying she's like a showgirl or something like that.
Yeah.
And in any case, they, say a couple sexy lines back and forth, and then it fades out or whatever, and says to the director's discretion, as if to say like, hey,
Yeah.
you can put a sex scene in here if you want to. You don't have to.
Right.
And it's the only one in the screenplay, and it makes me wonder. I mean, were they like, Ed, make sure you put in a possibility for some, sexploitation in here, or was Ed just so in that mindset that he's like,
Right.
let me throw it in, see what sticks,
Right. I kind of think the latter, because the rest of the screen, it wouldn't make sense really to make a sexploitation version of Frank Leahy's biography.
No.
Although that's fascinating to think about. But yeah, that's more so Ed can't help himself, is what I think. And that particular interaction, she is described as somebody who's been touring with the with the Follies. Not, I was going to say LA Follies, because of course that's where all the girls who made all the movies at Quality Studios with W. Merle Connell and George Weiss. They worked at the LA Follies, but the Follies generally was the it's shorthand for, that's the burlesque circuit, right? The quote unquote the wheel, right? That's the wheel. That's great. So she was a girl who toured on the wheel, and he is absolutely taken by the fact that as if she's almost like she's Marilyn Monroe, or she's some Hollywood star, because she's a burlesque dancer.
Yes, and interestingly, Ed in the screen, not in the dialogue, but in the descriptive stuff, makes a note that she may or may not be telling the truth. I mean, she may or may not actually be. Like, that's important to like Frank knows. Right. Frank just believes her, but Ed is like, I don't know.
She could be shady. Yeah, she could be shady. So you guys can see now, as we're getting deeper into the narrative's starting to crumble a little bit. And so after Frank's near-death experience, where he's saved by Patrick, the elderly janitor, he goes into he has to retire from football because of his health, and so he's still got another near 2 decades of living to do, and we blow through a lot of that really, really quickly. What do we ascertain, Paul? That he goes into quote unquote business, right? He seems to spend a lot of money on business ventures that ultimately he loses a lot of money in. It seems as if some businesses are kind of putting him on their boards because he's Frank Leahy, almost as a formality. He does talk about it's in the book more. It doesn't really get into it much in the screenplay. It's in the book more, but that during this time frame, he also really gets into sort of trying to talk up the youth of America, and I think it's mentioned that, he was, has letters written to him by people like Nixon and Eisenhower thanking him for his service and things of that nature.
Yeah, that's another thing they kind of tell and don't show, is that he mentions offhand at one point that, I've been doing these lectures and they seem to go over pretty well.
Yeah.
And so he has kind of a motivational speaking thing going on the side, which I think helps him get involved in the business world. Yeah. But Ed, instead of showing him giving a motivational speech or, whatever, he just mentions offhand, as if, and it's already been happening. He's like, oh yeah, I've been giving these lectures, I guess. And so that's just another thing.
Right. That looks like towards the very tail end of it, it looks like one of the more, I think he's telling Bernie that it's one of the few routes I have at this point to really make any money is on the speaking circuit. But it does tie back to when there's a scene early on when he's at Notre Dame. We're in speech class, And
Oh yeah.
the speech is, what did you do with your summer type of thing. So he actually tells the story of, I saw the jazz singer,
Mm-hmm.
sound came off the screen, and it literally it's earth shattering, and has changed the world. And then the father, I can't remember which one of the priests it is, but he says, "You're going to make a fine speaker. You make a fine
Mm.
speaker, Frank." But Frank ends it. He makes a speech and he goes, "The end" at the end of it. He goes, "You're
Mm.
going to make a fine speaker, Frank, but you don't need to say the end at the end."
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Fa Father Kavanaugh. Let's get into Father Kavanaugh a little bit. We haven't really mentioned his character much, but he's an instrumental character, certainly throughout the book, but increasingly uh, as we get through, Frank's Notre Dame years is
Hmm.
where Father Kavanaugh is most instrumental.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's one of the few characters that seems somewhat well drawn. Ed does a good job of making when he's introduced. First of all, introducing him instead of just because in the back half of the screenplay, in the front half of the screenplay, there's a lot of characters introduced as if they're going to be important, and then they just disappear. In the back half of the screenplay, there's a bunch of characters that pop up out of nowhere as if they had been established earlier.
Right.
Frank Kavanaugh is one of the few ones that bridges the gap where he has a pretty good introduction, and you have a pretty good sense of what kind of guy he is, and kind of carries through consistently throughout the story.
Yeah.
So it seems like it would have been a memorable character part for someone out of a bunch of forgettable parts in the movie. But he's kind of, he's what is he, the chaplain at uh, Notre Dame, or is he just a?
Yeah, well, I guess he's pretty high up on the food chain, because I think a little bit later when Father Hesburgh is hired, he says, "Father Hesburgh, now you got to watch out, Frank, because he's the vice president of the vice
Mm,
presidents." So
mm,
he's in the hierarchy at Notre Dame, and pretty empowered individual. Yeah, his character's drawn really well. He has a very distinctive. His speech patterns are very distinctive. Ed really
mm,
takes the time to actually make him sound kind of very formal.
mm,
Not uptight necessarily. He's a
mm,
pretty warm individual, and he and Frank have a really, really good relationship. There is one time early on when he sort of chides Frank a little bit, where
mm,
he says, it's one of the few times it is the sole time actually in the entire screenplay where somebody says, "Remember, Frank, this isn't all about winning. You go to Notre Dame. Remember the Catholic traditions and the value system that we're
right.
meant to uphold."
And
Because, well, go ahead. Yeah.
well, I was just going to say that that's another thing that makes him kind of a more interesting character than some of the others, and adds some uh, interesting moments into the screenplay, because there's a couple genuinely funny moments where Kavanaugh is both trying to be a priest and also root for the team at the same time,
Right.
and they might be at odds. He might, say, curse or something during a game and then catch himself, So a
Yeah.
couple things like that. But anyway, I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
Well, no, so Kavanaugh, yeah, so he sort of chides him early on, but subsequently, when Father Hesburgh apparently becomes even more empowered than he, by this point, Notre Dame is on this tear in the latter half of the 1940s. Frank has said at some point along the way, "I'm gonna, you know, go 100 games undefeated." He makes this claim, which, and Father Kavanaugh says, "You can do it, Frank. You can do it, Frank." And he doesn't quite pull that off, but he did have numerous seasons. I think even at some point he even had a stretch of 4 seasons in a row without an actual loss, which is,
Mm-hmm.
again, if you're a fan of college football, you recognize how impressive that is. But the program apparently starts to get a lot of criticism for being, him employing shady practices. They cut the amount of people he can recruit. I assume, there was some public hubbub in the latter half of the 40s around, well, it's not fair. Notre Dame can recruit lots more people. And
Mm-hmm.
Frank also is pulling shady plays. He's pulling
Mm-hmm.
shady plays to like get people to get an offside penalty,
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like that. And it is kind of shitty. And that's at the point where Father Kavanaugh reminds him. He goes, "Look, Frank, uphold the traditions of Notre Dame, because now look at, yeah, we want to win, but we don't want to win in a way that makes us look bad. And
right,
frankly, if you continue to do this," and this is a really real dramatic moment in the screenplay, Father Kavanaugh says, "If you continue to do things like this, Frank, you're going to get fired." And in fact, the other things he does are the fake injuries to stall the clock, let the mascot run out on the field to stall the clock. So he's a little bit of a, you know, he's not 100% straight arrow, far from it.
Right. Yeah, and actually, and that's a thing where you start to see where Ed might identify with a little bit of that in this. I mean, on one hand, Frank Leahy is incredibly successful in his chosen profession, right? So in that sense, Ed fell short of his own ambitions. Although, I mean, miraculously getting movies produced and shown in movie theaters is more than a lot of people do, but not becoming the next Orson Welles or whatever. However, slapping his movies together, cutting corners, figuring out tricks to get things done, taking footage from one thing, using it in another, getting money from this source and telling them one thing, but then doing this, So these little like tricks, he did to get things done that kind of similar to some of these,
That's good.
crafty little tricks that
right. That's real good. I guess
Frank
the key difference there is that Ed ultimately did not represent Notre Dame, right? So,
right.
right. So that's where, in painting this portrait of Frank, where he's capable of doing all kinds of shady things, where it's how much is this really about the Frank Leahy legend and lionizing him when it in some ways makes him look bad. Let's go to where he looks worst in my mind, which is the moment. Because again, we've seen it portrayed that he's had this close relationship with his wife, and they have at some point we have 4 kids, and then later I think it's up to 8 kids. So, and then he of course has this peccadillo in one of the weirder scenes in the book, which is hard to even understand what's happening. He's watching game footage at the local fire station, and then this is where a girl, I think her name's Cindy, she shows up and she's in I think a short skirt and quote unquote Angora. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, in case you were wondering, does Angora turn up in the script for the Frank Leahy legend? It sure enough does, and it turns up in the moment when essentially he's an adulterer, right?
Yeah, and they don't really set it up at all. It's not, again, the scene of him meeting up with a woman who's not his wife is dramatized, but it's not set up at all. And it doesn't pay off at all. It's almost like you're checking something off a list, but it's like, why would you want to check that off the list if this is the legend of Frank Leahy? Unless part of the legend is how much he got laid, which whatever.
Right.
But yeah, it's I don't know, maybe it's a sign of the times or what, but it's for a Hollywood biopic, seems strange to just not even pass judgment on it at all. It's just something he did. It's not like this is a bad thing or this is a good thing. It's just a thing that's happening.
Exactly.
And has no bearing on the plot or on his character
that's where
relationship.
Right. I think I don't want to say, well, yeah, it's misogynistic, right? I mean, generally speaking, the screenplay doesn't have any strong female characters with any sort of distinct characteristics whatsoever. Mom is very much just the mom stereotype, right? You can't even really think. You think about what female characters there are. The girls who are hanging out at the speakeasies, right? So early on, Coach Walsh, his high school basketball coach at Winter, says, "Hey, Frank, let's go out and he refers to the women on a couple of occasions. This is again where it's extremely old-fashioned and extremely misogynistic as quote unquote dollies, right? Let's go have some fun with some of the dollies." Right?
Yeah, and don't tell anyone or else I'll get fired. Don't tell the faculty.
Don't tell the faculty that I'm going out with a high school kid to pick up high school girls, right?
Yeah, which again goes back. I mean, I don't doubt that stuff like that probably happened or happens today, but I mean, people get in legal trouble for it. But it does seem like the jumping off point for one of Ed's, like a Stephen Apostoloff movie or something, like the coaches and athletes who sleep with the cheerleaders or whatever, and it makes its way into this Frank Leahy movie.
Speaking of which, I'm glad you said that, because you noted this to me, and I noted it when I first read the screenplay too. He refers on a handful of occasions, and the very first time he mentions football, he refers to footballers. So of course he
Right.
wrote a screenplay for Apostoloff that ultimately never got produced, called The Basketballers. but
Right.
but that's again common phraseology that's just a little bit weird. You
Yeah.
commonly in your life probably have not heard somebody refer to a football player as a quote unquote footballer.
Not too much. I mean, I think it comes up with like European football, like soccer. I think
Right.
they call them footballers, but
Right.
you don't super often say like, "Hey, Joe Namath was a great footballer." I don't think. I don't know.
Right.
But back to the Angora thing, that was a great moment. So I'm reading along, wondering if there's going to be Ed Wood stuff in the screenplay. You get to page 151, and finally Angora,
I know.
he's watching game footage at the fire station, as you said. A woman calls to him from outside. He jumps on the fire pole and slides down, all excited, runs out to meet her, and she's there in her Angora slip-over sweater and short skirt. And then he says, "You look and feel like a little bunny rabbit, Cindy." And then Cindy
Yeah.
says, "I'm all soft just for you." And then this is uh, for you, since you look at the loops, the intertitles on the loops.
The
Uh,
ums and stuff. Yeah.
exactly. Right after she says she's all soft just for Frank Leahy, she gives a nice with 10 M's after it.
So, how does this make Frank look good? I guess to your point, he gets laid a lot, right? Is that where
I
Ed's going with
guess.
this? Does
I
he
don't
think
know.
that makes him look good somehow? Because
I don't
in
know.
1975, 1976, you're talking about uh, feminism is political movement, and the world's a very different place, and
Mm-hmm.
the viewpoint on the dollies, right? That
Mm-hmm.
they're purely sexual objects is, really being severely questioned by the society, and he knows that. He knows
Yeah.
that because of the work he's doing in the socio sex realm with paperbacks and all the things he's writing in the sex
Mm-hmm.
magazines. But so that's again where I think you nailed it when you said Pride of the Yankees, right? It's
Yeah.
really that old fashioned of thinking. This is Ed saying to himself, if I'm going to make this biography about this guy from who was this legend in the past, gonna make it in very much sort of old school Hollywood terms, but he can't help leaking. He can't help leaking some of his own proclivities into it.
Yeah, and that whole thing is additionally confusing because Frank's wife is painted as a sympathetic character.
Yeah.
She's likable, and they seemingly have a good relationship. And even in the sequence where they're worried about her alcoholism, and she kind of goes off to what we would call a rehab now. I don't know what they call it in the screenplay, but um, he's supportive, and she comes back afterwards, and they continue their relationship together, and it seems like a nice relationship. So it's not even set up like, let me escape from my terrible wife, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have
Right.
gotten married, and none of that stuff. So yeah, it's just weird. It's just,
So
I don't know.
right, they have this good relationship, and he can just sort of commonly cheat on her. I guess you know
Yep.
culturally, I'm sure that is unfortunately very commonplace, but it was, I almost want to say, tolerated, right? The male dominant society at the time, guys could be guys, right? He was
Yeah.
just being a guy somehow.
Yep.
But so going back to these last 20 years, so yeah, he's lecturing and he's pumping money into various businesses, and he's serving on the boards of various businesses, and somebody a gentleman named Lou Wolfson, right? Which is clearly, in my mind anyway, I don't know if you took it this way, Paul, is a made-up character. Maybe it's based on a
Mm.
real guy, but Lou Wolfson, Ed's very deliberate with that name. He
Yeah.
sound Wolfson, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he's a guy who company that Frank is heading up, or on the board of. Uh, Wolfson basically explains to him how he can do a insider trading scheme to make a
Right.
lot of money, and Frank
Right.
says, "Sure, let's do it."
Yeah.
Let's do it. And then subsequently, Lou Wolfson, goes down for it, and Frank gets off uh, somehow by saying, "Well, I didn't really know
Yeah.
It goes to court, and he's like, I didn't really know that this was what was really happening. But the scene is described very, very clearly, where Lou Wolfson proposes to Frank a scheme, an illegal security trading scheme to make
Yeah.
money, and Frank says, "Sure, let's do it."
Hmm.
So he's portrayed not only as an adulterer, but he's also now portrayed as a inside trader.
Yes, I think the screenplay kind of tries to, oh, he didn't real. I mean, like you said, he did it, but he
Mhm.
didn't know it was wrong, and so therefore I'm not guilty because I didn't know it was
Mhm.
wrong. But
Right, right.
uh,
Uh, Trying to think, what have we missed? What have we missed? I
well,
know we're quite far in and we've covered a lot, but
yeah.
there's much to this, and I think there's other elements that we haven't really even touched on yet.
Well, it touched on it briefly, saying that, the last half kind of skips over stuff quickly or in kind of a perfunctory way, as if Ed's running out of his attention span or running out of room or on a time crunch or something. But interestingly, in that sequence, I mean, now we're post sports career, but
Yeah.
even during his coaching career, basically
Hmm.
post college, the screenplay quickly turns into a series of scenes where Ed imagines Frank working at home, and so or in his office, or his home office, or at a fire station sometimes, where Ed describes it as him sitting alone at a table, like doing some paperwork with a single lamp, and then the phone will ring, and he'll answer, and it'll be to him an old friend, but to us we've never heard of this person before in the screenplay, and they'll have a career opportunity for him that starts the next phase of the screenplay, only to skip to the next time he's sitting at home and the phone rings again, or maybe his wife will bring him the phone, and yet again another career opportunity from someone that Frank knows that we've never been introduced to. And then that propels him to the next thing of his career. There's 3 or 4 of these in a row, to the point where
Yeah.
it almost becomes Frank taking phone calls, the motion
Yeah.
picture, and it's real boring. And Ed doing the bare minimum. But you can picture, if you picture it in your head, it does seem like the kind of thing that would be in one of these movies he wrote in the 70s or whatever.
Sure.
And also reminds me of when you read Nightmare of Ecstasy, or hear interviews and documentaries or whatever, you can clearly picture Ed sitting in his apartment, at a table with a typewriter, and maybe he really emphasizes the single lamp multiple times. So he must have had a lamp or something that was special to him or something. Every time he has to have Frank working on something, it's in that kind of, you can almost picture Ed Wood slaving away on his books and stuff.
Right.
And that's like his frame of reference for work is, um, and so I thought that was interesting, even though
Right.
it's a sequence of, what's the bare minimum I can do to explain this guy's career. So it's not very cinematic and not super compelling reading, but you do picture Ed sitting there hammering away on stuff, So
Right. The hard work, right? The grunt work, and also the phone as sort of a conduit to opportunity, right?
mhm.
So Frank's networking to a degree, and I think it's in Nightmare of Ecstasy, certainly in Nightmare of Ecstasy, where it's mentioned that Ed was constantly on the phone, right? If Plan 9 came on, for instance, he'd
Right.
call up one of his friends and say, "Hey, Plan 9's on right now." And then there's also additional to that, there's when Frank starts to take ill. Um, he can't quite let go of coaching immediately, right? He can't just immediately resign, and so he's actually coaching bedside over the phone, and
Mhm.
he's literally, phoning in to practice, and he's phoning in plays. Here, you guys need to run this play, the 24A or whatever the hell it is, right? Some of these
Yeah.
plays are named by their, I guess, if you were a football player, maybe they're common plays or things that you would recognize, but there's that piece of it as well. So yeah, during the latter half of the book, yeah, he conducts some of his business, via phone, via bedside, and he
Mhm.
continues, of course, to obviously get closer to the end. And do you remember, Paul? Was it somebody recommends that Frank finally gets the idea in his head. Yeah, I think it's Father Kavanaugh who tells him, yeah, other people are making bios of themselves. You can make money doing that. But
Mhm.
it's a different priest who recommends. I'll introduce you to a guy named Bernie Williams,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. I
Father
don't.
Tom or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't totally remember exactly how all that goes down, but yeah, he's worrying about what he's going to do with his life and what his legacy is going to be, and they say, well, in order for people to remember you, you should, have a
yeah,
book written about you or tell your life story. It's tell your life story. You should tell your life story.
right,
And so, early on, one of the scenes after the jazz singer scene is uh, them at Notre Dame producing a film about Knute Rockne, and
right.
there's kind of the implication that Frank went to the movies and had his mind blown with sound movies, and then came with the idea, hey Knute, why don't I mean this? They don't say that, but it cuts from that to him giving a speech about how great movies are, to then suddenly they're making a movie about Knute Rockne, and so you want to think, oh, Frank made this happen, even though the screenplay doesn't say that. But there's a funny sequence in there where the director tells Knute like, "Oh, be yourself. You're being wooden, or be yourself. Act more like a
Yeah,
coach or
yeah, yeah,
something." And then they do another take, and then Knute starts like screaming at his players and saying all these four-letter words that could never be in a
yeah.
movie. And it's
Right.
actually a genuinely funny
It
scene with
is
good
funny.
good
It is
dialogue.
funny.
And it's funny, it comes to life when he's talking about being on a film set, as opposed to, you
Yeah,
skip over 1,000 football games, but you linger on, one scene featuring a guy directing a movie and so on. And you picture Ed
right.
playing the character of the director or whatever. Um, but it's interesting because, of course, there's the film Knute Rockne All American, which had Ronald Reagan,
As the Gip, yeah, the
yeah,
Gip.
the GIP, and so When One for the Gipper was big in the '80s because Reagan was president in the '80s. I don't
Mhm.
know how big that was in. I don't know, like in the '70s. I don't know if Knute Rockne All American was like a forgotten movie or if people were familiar with it, but there's a sequence where Leahy gives a inspirational speech to his athletes when he's a coach, and basically he is telling a secondhand account of Knute Rockne with the Gip,
Right.
with the "Win One for the Gipper" speech, uh, and I'm reading it thinking like, can you? I mean, this is already in a famous movie. Like, can you
Yeah.
have a third party who wasn't even there pump up your players by telling a story about another guy who was told by another guy to win one?
I
And
think
everyone watching the movie be like, yeah, I've seen this before.
what about the first time Gip appears in the screenplay? The Gip is described as Newt favored him more so than just about any. Newt loved him like a son. Blah, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but then he says, but the Gip could get away with almost anything. He was a gambler and he was a hustler and he was this and that, and he was a
Yeah,
troublemaker.
yeah,
It's like once again you're trying to build up the Notre Dame mythos, but it seems like
uh-huh.
almost insistently like Ed wants to somehow tear it down.
Yeah,
Uh, Although in a way in his mind I think he would think I'm making these characters more relatable and more human. They're like us, right? They're not
right,
these untouchable sort of football gods, but they're people just like us. But in the
right.
process of making them look like us, he makes them look like they're shady people. Newt's a really good character, by the way, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's
he's
true. That's
he's
true.
he's funny. He's funny often. Yeah, he's very profane. He's very apt to sort of blow up real quickly at everybody, but not in like some vicious way. But that's just his personality. He really only cares about, ultimately at the end of the day, are we going to win football games? But it's interesting because Frank and Newt end up in the same hospital room together.
Right, right, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So it's my understanding that's kind of part of the mythology that they worked together. Obviously, Leahy was coached by Knute Rockne, and Leahy idolized Knute Rockne, but that they really came together because they were both stuck in the hospital together, and because they were both stuck there, they got to really bond even more than they would normally, and
Yeah.
really share their genius ideas about coaching and football and stuff. And that's really where it's like in the hero's journey, like Luke has to go see Yoda in a isolated place where it's just the two of them,
That's
before he
great.
can come back as a real Jedi, or any number of examples
Yeah.
from Joseph Campbell or whatever. It's like, yeah, Newt had to get isolated into. I mean, Frank had to get isolated into this hospital alone with Knute before he could be reborn and
Yes.
emerge as the genius coach that he was meant to be.
And of course, I think it's in that scene actually where the game is going to happen, where his family's coming to see him play finally, but he's hurt. So
Right.
he basically he pretends like he's okay, and Knute says, "Okay, you're okay. You can go play." Because initially Newt's like, "No, you can't. Even though your family's coming, tell them to come some other week. You know, you're too hurt. You can't play right now." And
Yep.
so is it his, I can't remember, is his leg, is it his elbow? He basically gives Knute the other
Yeah.
arm or the other leg and says, "See how great it is." I think it's his elbow, and he says, "See how great it is." See what? And
Yeah.
Knute says, "Oh yeah, you're in great shape, of course." And later on, it's revealed Knute says, "Well, I knew you've basically deceived me, but I knew you wanted to play that badly because your
Yeah.
family was coming to see the game." Although
Yep.
ultimately his dad didn't come to see the game. He, ultimately ended up getting mugged and killed outside the speakeasy, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, Newt's a pretty interesting character in the book, and it was in the original article I wrote at Edward Wednesdays, where it was actually Joe Blevins, the founder of Edward Wednesdays, my associate there, who found an additional article. I wrote the article, but he found a basically a promo blurb for the release of the limited edition sort of slip covered hardcover version of the book in 1974.
Mhm.
And in that it's listed, you'll hear all kinds of startling facts. You'll hear that what legendary coach was actually flying to see his mistress when he died in a plane crash. And
Right.
it doesn't go there in the screenplay, but that is in fact in the book, where again, if you love Knute Rockne so much, Frank, do you want to protect his reputation, or do you want to say, yeah, he was supposed to be going to Hollywood to shoot The Spirit of Notre Dame, but he was actually also going to see his mistress. So
Right. And not only that, but to advertise the book with that as a selling point.
mhm.
You know what I mean? It's not just like, look, I'm going to tell it like it is, and I'm going to mention offhand that Knute Rockne wasn't perfect or whatever, or had his dalliances or whatever. It's not just that. It's, hey, let's front and center say, hey, a reason to read this book is that you're going to find out about Knute Rockne's affair. You know what I mean? Like, that's
Right.
crazy.
It is. It really is. Yeah, someone. So, et tu, Frank Leahy, right?
Or Bernie, or who knows.
Yeah, somebody. So, I think we've covered a lot of ground, Paul. I'm trying to kind of real quickly roll through the screenplay in my head. What do we missed? Anything really, really
Oh
important that
boy.
you want to
Well,
make sure that we don't miss touching on?
not really. I mean, I have a bunch of specifics, but we may not want to get into them now. Maybe do an article or something later calling out
Yeah,
some of the specifics.
yeah,
But yeah, the basic overall thrust of it is Ed avoids talking about football as long as possible in any detail. When they finally can't avoid it anymore, it's always skipped over in favor of post or pre or halftime scenes. Uh, and then by the time football's out of the picture, he's just skipping through Frank's life, so quickly that nothing really gets dramatized. Um, so it's almost like an anti-sports movie. And actually, even before Frank has scenes playing basketball, boxing, and baseball
yeah.
before he ever is shown on playing football in a football game. It's I mean, strange. It may be true, but it's strange narrative choices for what's
Right,
supposed to be a story.
right.
Um, but yeah, aside from that, all I had was like specific lines or specific turns of phrases that seemed
Woodian,
Woodian to me,
Woodian
like
somehow. Yeah.
just the tortured way people say things sometimes. Like early on, Frank says, "I'm out only to win." And what he means is like, all I want is to win, or I only want to win, or whatever. But Ed has him phrase that I'm out only to win, which seems like a counterintuitive way to say something like that. Um, what else was there? oh, there's a good line. Someone goes, "When do you find time for fun?" to Frank, and Frank goes, "Oh, I guess I just look around sometimes, and there it is." And I thought
Right,
that was like a legitimately good line.
right. Yeah, that
uh,
doesn't sound actually like Frank Leahy would say that, right? That sounds like somebody who has a very different viewpoint on how they go about their day to day.
yes. Oh, there's a scene where the phone rings, and instead of Ed going, "The phone rings" or something, the direction is, "It is at this time that the phone rings." It's like little
Yeah.
things like that, like, you know.
The language actually, you remind me, in the latter half of the book, there gets to be a lot more misspellings and little punctuation and grammatical errors. So again, we talked about this in previous Ed Wood Summit podcasts related to other items, but you can almost tell along the way at what stage of sort of inebriation Ed is in, based upon little clues like that. Just how
Yeah.
far afield does he go from any sort of basis in narrative reality, where he goes in
Mhm.
again into maybe his themes and obsessions, but also starts spelling, he starts mangling relatively common words,
Mhm.
misspelling them, and the syntax, to your point, the syntax starts to get really awkward and things of that nature. I did want to say, you reminded me that yeah, the basketball, really quickly, or baseball rather. His older brother Gene is a big supporter of his, and Gene, the character's not uh, extensively drawn, but he's an important character early on for Frank because he supports his younger brother a great deal. And apparently, Gene's been forced by dad to try to get into the boxing gig too, but he doesn't have big hands. He has small hands, and it's mentioned that he's broken his hands 6 times, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, Gene does subsequently, though, become a really great baseball player. And so during his time at Notre Dame, it's mentioned that when during the summer, Frank returns home and he plays for kind of what seems like almost like some kind of semi-pro sort of regional
Uh-huh.
baseball circuit where he plays baseball, he and Gene
Mhm.
even, it's mentioned at some point, is willing to financially support Frank
Mhm.
while he's at Notre Dame, but he's starting to raise his own family at that point, so Frank won't
Mhm.
take his money. But it's worth mentioning, since you mentioned the baseball thing, that and that's where Gene principally comes up.
Mhm.
Um, in the midsection, but early on, Gene's there. Gene's there in the barn when they're,
Right.
boxing early on as kids. So
Yeah.
he's an important character.
Yeah, and he's the one who says, "You're best at football. You should do football."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the first time anyone mentions it, but um, also uh, going back to the money, that's an interesting thing because part of the first act, you're waiting to find out if excuse me, if Frank is going to get a scholarship to Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And then he gets it, and we're all excited. But as soon as he gets it, there's the question of, how am I going to pay tuition? How am I going to pay, and usually I could see you get a scholarship that only pays tuition and you have to find your own room and board, or maybe one that only pays
Right,
room and
right.
board. And I don't know. Uh, but yeah, and his dad's like, "I'm not going to pay for it." And Gene is like, "I'll help you." And he's like, "I'm not going to take your money." And it's like, "Yeah, but you got a scholarship. Like, what? What's
Yeah,
the problem?"
what does the scholarship actually mean? Apparently, it's just a gateway into, because what is it mentioned? There's some ridiculous amount of kids who've been given scholarships. Something like, I think it's mentioned at one point, like there's 250 kids who have been given scholarships.
Mhm.
Um, which I take it credibly, right? A big, huge
Yeah.
school like that is going to give a huge amount of scholarships to try to get together a winning football team, because that's what it's all
Yeah.
about at the end of the day. And you can do no better, of course, than getting the winner from winner to head up your team, to not only play, on your team, but ultimately to head up your team. So,
Right.
so I kind of want, I think this is a good place to start to sort of wrap this up, Paul. I want to
Yep.
say, thank you for we've been at this now for a little bit over 2 hours, and lots of great stuff, and we've talked about this additional to what we've talked about here on the Ed Wood Summit podcast. So I'm completely open-minded, Paul, to talking more. Talking more about the Frank Leahy legend. I've become fascinated by this subject in the last month. Like, it's become utterly fascinating subject to me. So kind of give you guys a little background information. The book, The Frank Leahy Legend, was copywritten, filed for copyright again, renewed in 2009 by a not Bernard Williams, but a different author. And I've been trying to contact her, struck out thus far. But what my hope is, you know, maybe find out some additional historical details. Where did this come? Where did the script? What's the relation between the book and the script in terms of how Ed was hired? I have some other ancillary thoughts that Paul knows about, which again I'm not going to get that far afield here today because we're talking about the script, and that would take us way off track. But point here being, I intend fully well to continue to follow up on this piece of woodology, and I'm so glad it came up. It's been really in the last couple of weeks of my life. It's been I don't even know. This is gonna sound, you know, it's gonna sound corny, but a real sense of joy and delight to be able to
Yeah.
even get my hands on this screenplay and to be able to read it. So for those of you who feel that, you know, you may want to fill out a formal request at Loyola Marymount, I presume that you can probably get yourselves a scan of the book for about $50 or so, or even get yourselves a physical copy if you want to pay the shipping for maybe about $60 or so. But it would still, again, it is genuinely, I think, copywritten material based on my understanding of how copyright law works. But one of the reasons I want to get in touch with the current copyright holder of the book, of course, is to see, what about trying to get this thing out there so that people don't have to request it from a library and pay $50 for it, but can
Mhm.
actually just go, you know, go buy an ebook for a reasonable price, and it's got some apparatus around it, right? That being said, I think we'll continue actually to beat this gong because Paul's, I think, considering writing an article about the book. When we put it up at Ed Wood Wednesdays, we'll include some additional information, um, perhaps some, you know, a few quotes from the uh, screenplay, as well as a few snippets of the images from the actual screenplay itself, which again, the
Mhm.
scan looks like it's from probably what was Ed's original typewritten copy.
Mhm.
I'm almost certain of it. And I was talking to Joe Blevins, the founder of Ed Wood Wednesdays, and we've been doing a few of these podcasts recently. I was talking to him a few days ago, and he said to me, you know, I'm thinking about potentially doing, you know, a Frank Leahy piece, and I certainly encourage him to do so as well.
Yeah.
I kind of find this one fascinating. Again, my initial sort of snap reaction a month or so ago when I first read Iron Desire was that this is so nonsensical. It's so antithetical to everything that uh, speaks to me of what Ed's viewpoint on the world is. And
Mhm.
as I've gotten deeper into it, you can start to see how he found ways to make this material his own, to find
Mhm.
correspondences with the characters where he could make this material his own, and make characters that were relatable to an Ed Wood fan as opposed to a Notre Dame fan.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it. You can say anything you want in terms of last words, Paul, but I want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
What do you think uh, a Notre Dame fan, if you were a hardcore Notre Dame fan, like every Sunday or every Saturday or whenever the hell they play their games on the weekend, you know, you put on all the gear, and you had a party at your house, and you made sure you watched the game every weekend, and it was the focal point of your life. For that person, what would they think of the Ed Wood version of the Frank Leahy legend?
Well, it's hard for me to say because I am so not that person, but
Right?
I would guess that it would seem like a sort of bare bones, just telling the greatest hits that everyone already knows.
Yeah.
And I don't know that they would necessarily think it's anything like super special or anything.
Right.
I don't know if they would care whether it uh, shows Frank in the best light or not. But I would think they might think, oh, Notre Dame deserves a better treatment or a more grand. I mean, Ed tries.
Yeah.
He makes it a legend for sure, but maybe not in the way that a huge fan would want it
Right.
to be, I guess.
Right. So, and that this is how these podcasts seem to never end, because you remind me. He writes in the screenplay. He writes an alternate ending.
Oh yeah.
He writes two endings. He's like, you guys can have a choice. You can have a choice where we have Frank die, or we have Frank die, and somehow this magical religious experience uh, uh, comes into play, because now it's about, going back to what do they call the stadium, the Old Lady or something like that. I don't
Uh,
even remember
I
this,
can't remember.
but anywhere you stand on the campus at South Bend, anywhere you stand, you can see the football stadium.
Hmm.
It's the focal point of your life. So he does give an alternate ending where, if you're the real hardcore Notre Dame fan, we can end it that way, where it will remind everybody that this is bigger than Frank Leahy, right? This is
Right,
bigger than
right.
Frank Leahy. But
Yeah.
I watched a couple of days ago, again diving into this subject, which a month or plus ago I really knew almost nothing about. I found a video. It looked like a kid, like, who shot this literally within the last year or two, a YouTube video about 25 minutes long, and he's dressed up in all this Notre Dame gear. He looks like a kid. He looks like he's about 20, 22 years old, and he's talking about Frank Leahy. He's talking about, everybody's forgotten what a great coach Frank
Yeah.
Leahy was, and Frank Leahy was one of the greatest coaches of football of all time. And he goes through, many of the things that we've mentioned along the way here. So there is still this hardcore Notre Dame. I agree with you. Point here I'm getting at, Paul. I agree with you. The fans wouldn't have really cared about the imperfections of Frank's character, and maybe I don't judge in that sense either.
Mhm.
But again, does it leave a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth that he was, if he was an adulterer or if he was an inside trader? Yeah, that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But again, he's a human being. Um,
Right.
so I don't want to judge him too harshly on that score. But that whole win at all costs thing. I played a lot of sports when I was younger, and I like to play. And I knew a lot of guys who like to play to win, and they're two very vastly different things. And one of the reasons I kind of didn't play a number of sports in high school, one of the reasons why I didn't pursue, opportunities I had even to go to college and play sports, was because I didn't get that. I didn't relate to that vibe. That I wouldn't. It didn't matter. I wanted to play, to have fun, not to. But Frank, of course, and the whole machinery of Notre Dame is portrayed here as it's all about winning, is
Mhm.
absolutely everything, and that's of course rooted in the Rock, rooted in Knute's whole vision as well.
Right. Yep, and that's always a strange thing because obviously you want to have an attitude, you want to win. That's the point of playing.
Right.
But at the same time, there's always going to be a loser, and so to be so invested in winning, where you've got two teams against each other, 50% of the teams are always going to lose in that matchup. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And so I never understand it when people are so unforgiving about. I mean, I know, okay, if you're ever going to be Michael Jordan, or if you're ever going to be the best, you can't even think about losing. You can't accept it. You blah blah
Yeah.
blah. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, you're gonna lose sometimes. It's
Yep.
the way sports work.
Yep.
So it's always kind of mystified me there, but whatever.
Right. So, any final thoughts, Paul?
Well, I guess I would say two things. One is that when I initially was trying to get this from the library, I was just super excited. The idea of reading something by Ed that I've never read before, never heard anyone describe before, and seeing what secrets it might hold, I was super excited about that. As soon as I got it and started reading it, I got super excited about finding out, how did this come to be? You know what I mean? So that's the next. I mean, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to figure that out, but it used to be Holy Grail was getting the screenplay. Now Holy Grail is finding out how it got written, what the relationship is between Bernard Williams and
Right.
Edward D. Wood Jr., um, what the relationship is with the church, why it's in this collection,
Yeah.
all that stuff. If we could figure that stuff out, that would be awesome. The other thing was getting it. I've said a couple times, wondering how much of Ed would actually be in the screenplay, and you touched on this as well. And of course, we're pleased to find out that he worked himself into it, and it's definitely from his point of view and all that kind of stuff. But I was thinking, I guess I should have just never doubted it in the first place. Like, Ed never disappoints. That's what's great about him. I mean, everything that's ever been found has always had an obvious touch of Ed Wood's personality in
Right.
it. So why
Right.
should the screenplay be any different? I shouldn't be surprised. I should have known, getting into it. There's
Yeah.
no way this is going to be a dry paint by numbers, I'm just doing a job type of thing.
Right.
Ed just can't do that. I mean, he could not help himself. He has to, be Ed, and I think that's what everyone likes about him.
Yep. That's what makes it so, this whole entire journey for me, but so exciting, not only on this particular item, the Frank Leahy Legend screenplay, but you remind me, just over the course of the last couple of days, and there'll be much more to come on this at Ed Wood Wednesdays and the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I read a short story from a magazine in 1962. Again, I can't get into all the details yet until I vet this a little bit more thoroughly, but just read this last night. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Paul about what we're talking about here today, and then at the tail end of the night, I read this, and it's I'm 1,000,000% absolutely certain that it's a short story written by Ed Wood. So the fact that this material he always delivers, and there's so much more material out there than we know about at this point, and it's so exciting that nearly we're coming up on now, what, 43 years since his passing, and more and more material continues to turn up. And will we ID it all ever? Not likely. Will we speculate that some things are Ed Wood and we don't have a direct reason to documentary evidence proof of that Ed wrote it? Yeah, that's going to happen too. This one is a slam dunk in every way imaginable. It's got his own signature and date on the cover page, and yes, as we've been talking about here for the last couple of hours, it's absolutely rife with Woodian touches in every way, shape, and form imaginable. I think the only thing I want to say in closing is I want to thank you one last time, Paul, for joining me here today. I think this was awesome. I had such a blast here talking about this, and we will continue to go down this road inevitably. I think we can't help ourselves at this point.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. As soon as I saw the first Ed Wood Summit, I thought, I got to figure out a way to get on one of these. At the time, I didn't have anything to talk about, but Screenplay came my way, and so I'm glad
awesome.
We could make an episode out of it.
Absolutely awesome, and I'm glad it happened as well. I'm glad you're here, and for everybody else, I'm going to close. I'm going to let you know, Lou Holtz, the Notre Dame coach Lou Holtz, once said, one of his more famous quotes. Of course, Frank Leahy's we didn't mention Frank Leahy's most famous quote is,
right.
When the going gets tough, the tough get going, or when the going get tough, the tough get tougher, or however you want to phrase it. That's sometimes generally attributed to Frank Leahy as one of his most famous quotes, and you've certainly heard that before. Here's one you probably haven't heard. So Lou Holtz, a Notre Dame coach, I believe back in probably 80s, 90s time frame, he said, no one has ever drowned in sweat. No one has ever drowned in sweat, which is bogus. Literally, did you drown on sweat? No, but how many kids die every summer on some 95-degree football field while some asshole is telling them, get down and give me 20 more? So I'll end it on that. You guys obviously understand my viewpoint on all of that very, very well. And thank you all for joining us here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. We'll be back again, and I look forward to talking to you guys again. I think Paul and I are probably going to continue to delve into this subject more deeply, and perhaps, Paul, if you'd be so gracious, you'll come back and join us here again at some point in the future on some topic related in some way, shape, or form to Ed Wood.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a great time, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.